Are you there? Did I lose you? Okay, didn't lose you.
We're here. We're here.
All righty. Good evening, everybody. I am having problems accessing the document while I'm with you. It's just proving not to be good. Okay, wait. Hopefully we're here. All right. All righty. I think we're in, and I think I'm completely good. And again, I apologize to everybody. First couldn't get in and then couldn't open the document. But I believe we are here. And ready to go.
Great. And Jennifer, before we begin, just so you know, the phone number that's there is Fred.
Very good. Alrighty. It's a little bit of a problem, but we will make it work. And I don't want to hold people up any longer. So why don't we begin? I'll figure it out as we go. All right, are we letting people in? Are we ready to begin? Are our panelists here?
We're ready to go.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Jones Austin, and as you can tell, given that it's 3:06, that I'm having a little bit of a challenging afternoon, but hopefully I'm beyond the challenges right now, accepting the fact that you can't really see me well, but we'll take care of that in just a minute. I want to thank you all for joining the Racial Justice Commission this afternoon for what I anticipate will be a very rich and meaningful afternoon of information and dialogue about critical issues in New York City and around the nation concerning continuing racism. The aim of the Racial Justice Commission is to identify within the New York City Charter, which is our Constitution, the laws, the foundational structures that have allowed racism to persist through government functioning and government relations with community, with businesses, and with other enterprises, since the founding of New York and in the years since. We are looking to you, experts and thought leaders, subject matter experts, to help us understand how we as commission members appointed by the mayor, but dare I say not beholden to the mayor, how we can take the first steps for the city to begin to dismantle the systemic racism that persists because of structural laws embedded in the New York City Charter. So we want to talk to you, hear your experiences, your thoughts, your ideas. We want you to point us in the direction in which we should be moving, and help us to essentially dig deeper and understand what we may not already know. We are talking with many people throughout New York City and across the nation to gather as much information as we possibly can. We are a commission of 11 persons, New York City-based persons from, who hail from the 5 boroughs. On this call with us today, on this Zoom, are several commission members. I will call their names. Our vice chair is Henry Garrido. We have Commissioner Joanne Yu, Commissioner Chris Coy. We have Commissioner Phil Thompson, Commissioner Ana Bermudez Dean, Commissioner Larry Daniel Favors, and Commissioner Fred Davey. And there are several other, just a few other commissioners who cannot be with us today. And their names are on the Racial Justice Commission website. If I try to do it off the cuff, they are Kay Bain, Yesenia Mata, and that may be it. I think that's it. We're also joined by our executive director, Anusha Venkatraman, and then several of our Racial Justice Commission leadership and staff. You'll also see that we have a ASL interpreter who is with us as well. So these meetings are public. Oh, and Derek Hamilton, forgive me, I forgot. I knew I was missing someone. Forgive me. Thank you, Labrie. Commissioner Derek Hamilton. And I hope he forgives me for not remembering him in the moment. I certainly do remember him, but just not in this moment. I appreciate all that he's doing. So we're here to hear from you. We've lost a few minutes. We're going to gain them on the other end. We're not going to take them from you, but we're going to find a way to make sure that we're hearing from all of you. The way this is set up, there are 3 panels. And the first panel, each panelist has been asked to speak for a period of no more than 8 minutes. And then we will have dialogue of the commissioners with the panelists. This is not a commissioner to commissioner dialogue. That is reserved for public commission meetings. This is a panel meeting. And the purpose of this is to hear directly from you and then to dialogue with you, excuse me. So I'm just going to jump right in. However, first I'm just going to ask Anusha, is there anything that I'm leaving out that everybody needs to be mindful of?
No, I think that's a wonderful introduction. Thank you.
Okay, good deal. Let's just jump right to it. The first panel, 3 persons, Sheila Foster, Raya Salter, and Summer Sandoval. Sheila Foster is the Scott K. Ginsberg Professor of Urban Law and Policy at Georgetown University. Foster is a recognized authority on the role of cities and city leadership in promoting social and economic welfare, achieving environmental and climate justice, improving global governance, and addressing racial inequality. From 2017 to 2020, she served as the chair of the advisory committee of the Global Parliament of Mayors and is currently a member of the New York City Mayor's panel on climate change. She's the co-chair of the equity work group for the panel. Raya Salter is an attorney, educator, and clean energy law and policy expert with a focus on energy and climate justice. She's the principal of Imagine Power LLC and a member of the New York State Climate Action Council, which is developing New York's plan to reach the nation's leading climate action goals. New York is developing New York's plan to do that, to reach the nation's leading climate action goals. She's also the policy organizer for the NY Renews Climate Justice Coalition. And thirdly, we had Summer Sandoval, who is the Energy Democracy Coordinator at UPROSE. In this role, Summer leads many energy democracy campaigns, such as developing New York's first community solar cooperative, fighting peaker power plants, and implementing a local just transition through UPROSE's community-led comprehensive water plan called the Green Resilient Industrial District Grid Plan. So I'm going to ask each panelist to speak for about 8 minutes, and you will follow each one. We won't ask you questions in between, and then the commissioners will engage in a Q&A dialogue with the 3 of you. So let us begin with Sheila Foster. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's such an honor to be here. And let me dive right into my remarks, because I know that 8 minutes will go by quickly, but it's an honor to share the panel with Summer as well as Raya. So I've spent my career, as the other panelists have, on issues of environmental and climate justice, and in particular, the legal and policy processes that lead to the distributional inequities in the way that BIPOC communities have experienced for many years. First, I'll say that the environmental justice concept understands the environment as the places or communities where we live, work, and play. And these communities have, as it's been established, more pollution and toxic exposure. They're hit harder by climate impacts, heat, flooding. They have higher energy burdens, including energy bills, and they live in less efficient homes. At the same time, they have less access to clean water, green space, green amenities, and affordable and quality housing, as well as less access to energy generation that is distributed, such as microgrids, as well as rooftop solar panels, for instance. And COVID has laid bare these vulnerabilities, as we know in a Harvard study that between COVID infection and level PM air pollution, which previous studies have shown these communities are unequally exposed to. And the roots of all of this vulnerability, this ecological and social vulnerability in these communities, is a manifestation of the systemic racism that was already mentioned. And this includes a history of racial covenants, racial zoning by local governments, redlining, and urban renewal and slum clearance programs, the legacy of which has been entrenched and exacerbated by the way that we zone today, exclusionary zoning practices and predatory property tax and mortgage foreclosures in communities of color. So there's been a history of land dispossession and displacement in these communities that continues today through market-based development policies that gentrify these communities, and that's made worse by decades of underinvestment and disinvestment. So my recent work focuses really on how our legal and regulatory system can be reformed in ways that support the creation of healthy, sustainable, and just communities that provide equitable access to green space amenities, clean air, water, healthy food, affordable housing, high-speed broadband, and safe neighborhoods. The history that I talked about has created an uneven playing field that prevents residents in these communities from receiving these resources or from participating equally in local decision-making processes. And the high and rising value of urban land in places like New York City also is a barrier, as we've seen, to the provision of these goods. Increasingly, many residents in these kinds of communities across the US, in New York City and really across the world, are beginning to assert their right to urban infrastructure, vacant land and structures to build affordable housing, community cooling centers, urban gardens, entrepreneurial spaces, and other kinds of localized, heavily hyperlocal goods. In some cities, for instance, mothers have led the movement to occupy vacant homes that are owned by local governments or state governments to address homelessness and housing instability at a time when the COVID pandemic has made paying rent unmanageable for so many, and despite the risk that they can be removed at any minute by their local government. And communities here in New York have long struggled to maintain access to community gardens on vacant land, for instance. So in my work, I've argued that this available vacant underutilized urban land and infrastructure under the control of the local government should be more than just assets for market exchange but should be considered a common resource that can be utilized and shared with these communities. My colleagues and I, as part of a larger research project called Co-Cities, have identified examples of policies and initiatives in cities working with these communities, particularly the most vulnerable, to share this available urban infrastructure to co-create with these communities housing, broadband, energy, food, and other critical resources to help them survive and thrive in urban environments. And we're beginning to see local governments utilize this idea to make bold investment in BIPOC communities as a response to systemic racism. So the city of Seattle, for instance, recently announced it would transfer $1 million in a fire station to the Africatown Community Land Trust, designed to help that historic Black community develop affordable housing and business opportunities for its residents. And it's a collaborative effort between the community and the city's Department of Neighborhoods and Planning. These initiatives and efforts are very much linked to the idea of the right to the city, which has been a principle codified in city charters and also state and federal laws abroad. Most recently, the Mexico City Charter, but also Mexico City built on the experience of similar initiatives, including Brazil's city statute, the Montreal Charter of 2006, and the World Charter on the Right to the City. So my proposal is to suggest an amendment to the New York City Charter that embraces a similar right to the city, focused on a commitment to the equitable use and sharing of city infrastructure according to principles of sustainability, democracy, equity, and social justice. And this would entail the following three aspects, and I'll stop here. First, a civic or community use right to urban infrastructure, which would be rooted in the the social function of property principle, which is included in many of these charters. My study of this principle is that it elevates community use value of public infrastructure, such as vacant land and structures, over market exchange value. It would privilege communities utilizing vacant land and structures under the authority of the local government in disinvested and underinvested communities, and would work with public authority to engage residents in the construction of affordable housing and other goods that are put into limited equity legal instruments that maintain the affordability of these goods over time. So principle one is a civic or community use right to urban infrastructure. Principle two would be public community partnerships, which facilitate the right of communities to use and collectively manage these land or structures under the control of local authorities to form new community-based enterprises constructed from these abandoned city assets. And this would ensure that disadvantaged and underinvested communities are actively engaged in the process of making the city more just and inclusive. And the third and last principle is what I would call collaborative budgeting, which would build on a version of what's now currently called participatory budgeting, but would be designed to support the public community partnerships mentioned above. These would be neighborhood-based targeted funds dedicated to community-based enterprises that are the result of a process of bringing together key community institutions and stakeholders to co-design and to co-construct these enterprises. So that's my proposal. Those are my comments. I think I'm at the 8-minute mark. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, and looking forward to having a conversation with you in just a short while. Raya Salter, please begin.
Hello, thank you so much for this opportunity to appear before you today. It is an honor to speak to you. It's an honor to be on this panel with my distinguished colleagues. So thank you so much for that again. Again, my name is Raya Salter. I'm an energy attorney based in New Rochelle, and I am a member of the New York State Climate Action Council, which is developing the scoping plan for how New York will achieve its statewide greenhouse gas emissions goals. I started my career as an energy associate with the law firm of Dewey and LaBeouf in New York City. In prior roles, I was a regulatory attorney for the Environmental Defense Fund and a senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council. And I've really worked with activists, community stakeholders, utilities, and others from New York to Hawaii and other jurisdictions to promote the just integration of clean and renewable energy onto electric grids. I'm an adjunct professor of law at Cardozo Law School, and my book Energy Justice was published in 2018. So just a bit more about myself. I also am a big fan of popular education on these issues, so you can find me. I encourage all of you to consider me your climate auntie, and that's also where you can find me on IG and TikTok, and reach out to me there and elsewhere anytime. So right now, we are really at a critical moment as we in this commission march relentlessly forward for racial justice and equality. We navigate difficult political waters in DC and at the state, and a vanishing window for climate action. Yet I'm here today to tell you about the power of New York City and New York State's leadership on climate and recommend alignments that could begin to bring a measure of course correction on climate and environmental injustice. So first, to do that, I want to talk a bit about New York State's landmark climate law, the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Powered by activists, including the New York Renews Coalition, is one of the state's most ambitious climate laws, but also completely unique, the only state in the country that has this type of robust energy, climate, and environmental justice provisions that have been massively influential. So what is the CLCPA trying to do writ large? We're talking about a 85% reduction in GHG emissions by 2050. That's 100% zero emissions electricity sector by 2040. Big investments in solar, offshore wind, transmission, goals for energy storage, they could be higher, and big investments in thinking towards energy efficiency and building electrification. We know that the vast majority of New York City's emissions come from the building sector, so that's particularly important. But let me get to these provisions that I mentioned, just a couple of them. These are among other things that are in the law. But the state law says that state contracts and decisions must not disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. Now, that phrase, disadvantaged communities, was borrowed from California law. It's a bit of an unfortunate phrase, but it's the phrase that we've got in terms of the statute. It is not the preferred phrase for a lot of folks. The law also requires that emissions and co-pollutant reductions be prioritized in these disadvantaged communities. And I'll talk a bit more about how those communities are being identified at the state and federal levels. When I talk about how the New York City and New York State leadership on climate has shaken the ground in this country, it truly has. So what the CLCPA did is it includes a goal that for state law, 40% of state spending to fight climate crisis and create a clean energy economy must be directed to disadvantaged communities. Now, this has been adopted by the Biden administration as the Justice 40. It's really important that folks understand that that came from New York, that that came from the activist community, and that these two ideas of a redirect and investment frame for climate and energy investments into frontline communities is happening at both the state and the federal level. In fact, the Biden administration released draft Justice 40 guidance literally just a few days ago on July 20th. And as you can imagine, these concepts are developing in terms of the standards and how they'll be implemented on separate tracks. What is New York's process? So New York created, the statute created a Climate Action Council that I mentioned before. It's developing the scoping plan. It created a climate justice working group to develop the criteria of who is a disadvantaged community. And that draft criteria is expected as early as next month. And that climate justice working group is made up of several stakeholders, but including environmental justice activists, UPROSE, Summer, who's sharing this panel with me, the executive director of UPROSE is in that process, as are other key environmental and climate justice advocates and activists. So what else is going on that's really important to understand? The Department of Environmental Conservation has provided interim guidance on what a disadvantaged community is, and it won't surprise. And what that interim guidance is it located within a census block group that meets HUD's 50% AMI and is also in a New York State Opportunity Zone. And it won't surprise folks that there are large swaths of New York City that qualify as disadvantaged communities and that are expected to qualify under both the state and federal guidelines. So what are some of the key intersections that I think that New York City should be thinking about and thinking about in the context of charter amendments? Identifying disadvantaged communities, creating standards for benefit. What does benefit mean to a disadvantaged community? We encourage dollars spent is the benefit level, not any other more abstract. In New York State, we've had some success when we've seen it in terms of dollars spent. Require interagency coordination and compliance plans, require program audits and ways to evaluate, track, and enforce this type of spending, require stakeholder consultation. And it's really important that New York City begin to think about best practice on these issues now. And also I encourage folks to both leverage the wealth of city actions on race, revitalization, and the environment. There's a New York City climate emergency. There's a myriad, we have the Office of Sustainability. There are a myriad of plans, Office of Resiliency, that are happening. New York City has been leading on this issue. Leverage what New York has already done to amend and adjust the charter to provide for methodologies to evaluate disproportionate burden, how to prioritize emissions and co-pollutant reductions in disadvantaged communities. And when you do this, New York City will be aligning with New York state law. I also really encourage this commission to think about the lessons learned from New York City's experience with COVID and recovery-related disbursements. We know that a lot of money went out. We know that minority and women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, and others were not able to equally access that funding. And so the creation of financial mechanisms and infrastructure for the equitable distribution and absorption of these investments is critical to ensure that money actually goes to community-led projects. So I will end my comments here and just really encourage this commission to think about how New York City really is in a place to take advantage of what the state and what the city and what the federal government, how they are realigning in terms of climate and energy investments, which could have important near-term implications in both the infrastructure package and potential reconciliation packages. But even as important is aligning for how this revitalization can go forward equitably going forward. And thank you very much. I will end my comments there.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from Summer Sandoval.
Thank you, and I deeply appreciate the opportunity to share space with you all today and share comments. Again, my name is Summer Sandoval, and I'm the Energy Democracy Coordinator at UPROSE. Our Executive Director, Elizabeth Young-Pierce, sends her regards. For those who don't know, UPROSE, we were founded in 1966, and we are the oldest Latino community-based organization. We are an intergenerational, multiracial, women of color-led organization, and we work at the intersection of climate change and racial justice. And we do that through advocacy, policy, community engagement, youth leadership, and cultural artistic expression. UPROSE has achieved a lot, and it's over 55 years since its inception. We've stopped deciding at power plants. We've doubled the amount of open space and facilitated years worth of community-based planning and proposals. Sunset Park is an environmental justice community of over 130,000 in South Brooklyn, also home to New York City's largest significant maritime industrial area, SMIA, and suffers from a long legacy of exposure to pollution from peaker power plants to brownfields to several solid waste transfer station, the Guanas Expressway that traverses the community north to south and sees over 200,000 cars and 25,000 diesel trucks every single day, which are all exacerbated by the climate crisis. And despite all of this, we've been able to achieve a lot. Some of our recent victories include passing legislation on every single level, from the city's Climate Mobilization Act and Local Law 97 to the state Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that Raya was discussing, to developing New York City's first community solar cooperative. And that process in increasing and building community capacity, not only to provide the benefits, but to really be investing in building the leaderful engagement with the community to participate in a localized clean energy system as informed stakeholders to be able to participate in that way. That is very different from traditional systems. We are working with both city and state agencies to create equitable markets and operationalizing community-led plans. And just this past January, successfully achieved helping bring $200 million in state investments to the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, which is just 3 blocks that way, right the direction from our office, to transform the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal into offshore wind staging and assembly port. This investment in clean energy infrastructure will bring thousands of direct and indirect jobs, and is part of the comprehensive community-led plan in operationalizing the green reindustrialization of our waterfront, a plan that is the culmination of about a decade's worth of community-based planning on how to implement policy, bring funding and resources to community-led projects and infrastructure, not only create jobs, but create the resources for training and education to ensure that these well-paid, family-sustaining, career-building jobs are accessible to the community, which is also part of spending 7 years to defeat the billion-dollar private developer-led industry city rezoning that threatened to displace and gentrify our community, which is in exact opposition to what the community has said they wanted in the grid plan. And this plans like these developer-led plans really inhibit and reduce the not only local capacity to produce, but or industrial spaces need to be thought about differently. We see this issue across the city and across many cities across the country, when industry is dying and it's being turned into high-end retail and luxury uses, which really inhibits the local ability to produce. And it's that ability to produce and to create clean energy that's going to really pose a huge climate justice problem in terms of using our spaces to build for a climate future when it comes to adaptation, mitigation, resilience. Even though we celebrate so many transformational victories, our community is constantly threatened and put in harm's way by the business as usual development model and the existing processes that constantly force our communities to fight for the right to live. This includes the proposal to power two of the largest peaker power plants that is in total over 800 megawatts of fossil fuel based energy in our community, burning fuel oil and natural gas, making bad pollution days even worse in a community with already extremely high asthma and upper respiratory rates. We have private developers also proposing to bring commercial and demolition C&D waste handling into the community. And we see the rapid and unregulated growth of e-commerce development. There's a 1.2 million square foot development being proposed right on 21st Street in our community that poses a really big threat to the local economy, to safety, traffic, and transportation, as well as exposure to air pollutants. And of course, the reform to ULURP, the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, a lot of acronyms. So that these structures, these systems need to be changed to be able to better protect our community so that we can use our time and energy and resources to build the infrastructure that are going to create the equitable systems we seek. And to promote racial equity, it's absolutely necessary to work with environmental justice community leadership to create those systems to prioritize community decision-making and planning and solutions. So in terms of the asks, it's, these ideas aren't new. They are the culmination of years of work and years of community planning to operationalize the comprehensive community plans like the grid that are both scalable and replicable community-based models that address land use, zoning, policy, funding, infrastructure, and transportation, and to co-create co-governance models with frontline community leadership and not treat environmental justice like a fad. We're seeing it a lot. Environmental justice is all the rage, unfortunately, and we see people treating it as a very superficial checklist item where people or groups and individuals are running to get funding to pick our brains in a very extractive manner. And they're not accountable to our communities, they're not accountable to community leadership. And so these types of practices are against environmental justice principles. Like Raya also mentioned the movement of resources as investments directly to environmental justice communities, 40% outlined in both the state and federal level being the minimum and not seeing as the baseline, not the ceiling. And, at the very heart of this, the understanding of implementing a just transition is not solely about the outcome. That we could go 100% emission free and that would not be achieving a just transition, and that the just transition is rooted in principles and process, and that's going to take true partnerships and co-governance models to achieve that just transition. Lastly, I want to just say that we need accountability measures so that we know exactly where and how our recommendations are being incorporated into change, and what are the timelines and implementation, what are the tracking and enforcement strategies and mechanisms so that we can be working as true and equal partners in creating these equitable systems. We're in an era of COVID and climate change where, a seat at the table is no longer enough. We need to have a true say in decision-making in creating a equitable system together. And I'm happy to submit my written comments, and I again appreciate the opportunity to share comments and deal with this amazing panel. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank all three of you. We are transcribing this, but if you have the documents, your remarks written out and are willing to share them, that would be helpful to us. We very much appreciate them. A lot has been said. I have questions, but I want to first ensure that our commissioners have the opportunity to engage directly with you. And so I'm going to ask commission members if you have questions to raise your hands, and we can begin dialoguing with our guest panelists. If I don't see a hand go up right away, then I'm just going to jump right in. And so I don't see a hand, but I'm going to talk very slowly, just this online. I don't see a hand.
Chair, do you see my hand?
I don't see, you know what, you've got this colorful background going, and so your hand blended in, I didn't see it. Thank you, Vice Chair Garrido, please begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for your presentation. And this is a question for the entire panel. I think all three of you addressed kind of the issues that we're grappling with, which is where real, actionable ideas we could put together with this on the concept of equitable distribution. And I think this issue is very close to my heart, as many of you probably heard. But I think that, several of you recommended ideas on either cooperative ownership or some sort of community involvement in the decision-making process for the actions that have been proposed. And I find that to be very, very helpful, very intriguing. And I want to push you a little bit about how you think that would be implemented in an existing charter structure, which already is riddled with, a lot of these overly bureaucratic processes that do that. And you got the state, you got the federal, you got the city, you got all these things. From a practical matter, in terms of amending the city charter, proposing a possibility of amending the city charter, what are some of the practical applications of some of these ideas that are very lofted and very well implemented, in your opinion? And any one of you could probably.
I mean, I'm happy to start. That's a great question. And I hear in your question a lot of skepticism about current planning and other participatory models where communities get a chance to come and say something. And that goes from federal, state to local, and those processes exist. And there's been a lot of frustration with those processes. What I've been talking about is not simply more community involvement or participation. And I think, Summer said not just a seat at the table, but rather there are models. Land trusts are one, with a tripartite governance board where you have part community, part leaseholders or people who are leasing land, and part public and other officials, where it's a true co-governance model. There are distributed micro energy grids, for instance, that are now popping up in cities everywhere. So one proposal would be to allow the utilization of excess energy from CUNY and public hospitals to feed into a Harlem grid, for instance, to make that community more resilient. But you do need, so those are all ideas that are decentralized, in place, very localized models. But in order to really activate those, I guess my comments were suggesting that you need a more substantive, not a participatory, but a more substantive right embedded in the city charter and constitution. Unless you have that substantive right, for me, it's not a real reform, simply to ask for more participation or more seats at the table. So I'll stop there. I'm curious to know what my co-panelists believe.
Yeah, I can offer some comments, and thank you, Professor Foster, for what are excellent ideas and also excellent examples of the type of structures that we need to support and have exist if these investments in climate are actually going to result in community-led projects, or even be absorbed by frontline communities or even MWBEs at all. And so that piece that that Summer also emphasized, that piece on tracking and enforcement methods, and also this piece of requiring real interagency accountability, enforcement, coordination, and auditing in terms of, where is this money going now? Where does it need to go? And where is it needed? And so these are the types of things that I think could be productive amendments to the charter.
And I'll also just add that, for us, it's the kind of the twofold, right? On the one hand, it's what needs to be done in terms of creating the new. And then on the other hand, it's what needs to be changed or fixed in the existing system that are posing such big challenges and obstacles for what we're doing. Because we're inventing it as we go. We're learning and inventing and doing it all at the same time. And, in terms of cooperative ownership, like this is something it looks different with different pieces of a community assets and infrastructure. And at the forefront of cooperative ownership is building the community wealth, right? And that we're having to play catch up, because everything from what type of incentives exist, how those incentives move, what financing models, what investors invest in, all of these systems are set up for very traditional developers. They're not, and they were never created to support community-led projects. And so this is something we're documenting and learning as we do our projects, as we put infrastructure on the ground in terms of, okay, that regulatory change, that regulatory issue is a challenge for us. This, how utilities treat, community-led interconnection, that's a challenge. The structure of the investment tax credit, that's a challenge. And so it's through our personal, experiences on doing these community-led projects, that documenting process, that we are hoping really we can have that meaningful engagement and that on that level to really say, look, these are all the challenges. And how can we incorporate these challenges to address that? We were not going to just say, okay, how much money do we have to put towards clean energy to get to an equitable market? We need to lay it out. It's not just funding, it's how everything is structured and synergized together that either work or don't work for community-led projects. The short story we say is we can't let big oil become big renewable energy. And if you want to support community-led projects, we have to support them from the get-go. And then, in terms of the existing systems part, happy to continue conversations in terms of how is the existing charter creating challenges to moving work forward, because I think this panel is awesome. I think we've learned a lot, and this is kind of just the first step, right? The introduction.
My second question is more appropriate to what I do, right? I'm a labor person. I'm a union guy, right? So I think one of the things that Ms. Foster and it talked about was the disproportional, I would say, distribution of resources. I think all of you alluded to it at some point. My challenge is green renewable energy also brings the tremendous prospect of good paying jobs for people in our community. And a lot of the times those jobs have eluded the people of our community. So it's I call it adding insult to injury, right? By excluding them, right? And quite frankly, unions have been part of that process. Bad process, good process, bad process, right? So how would you suggest that we, the people who are in labor, right, in doing this, perform more, sincere process of recruiting and retention minority community members to these good paying jobs, and begin the process of that training? Because I think that has been always a challenge, and a lot of us put resources as a challenge. But to be honest, your resources is only part of the story, training of it. So the training, hiring, and recruitment, if you could just comment to that, Madam Chair, thank you. Those are my questions.
I mean, I will say that community capacity and training is a huge, that is a resource, I think, actually, and it also needs resources to support that. But Raya is really the expert on energy justice, and I'm just gonna cede all my time to her because I know we're short on time.
She says, talk to Ms. Raya, and I know that Ms. Summer has a lot of things to say here too. Just as a preliminary. Just as a preliminary answer, I want to go back again to the structural pieces, because this is really happening. And my major concern when Summer talked about EJ as being a fad and a checkbox is, just as Summer was saying, we're kind of figuring this out. The state is literally figuring it out as well. And the federal government is literally figuring it out as well. And the feds, they just put out their guidance, and they're literally looking to New York State in terms of who is going to be a quote unquote disadvantaged community. There's a lot to say about how we need to make sure that we get new manufacturing sectors, and Summer could speak to the GRID project. They have a lot of plans there. We want to create industry in New York. We want local jobs for local folks with a focus on frontline communities. And we need to make sure that those criteria are matched up, that federal, state, and city criteria backed with those mandates and those enforcement mechanisms, so that at the very least, the resources are directed to specifically, including consideration of census, race, health, that the resources are directed into that area, and there's accountability that those resources, training and otherwise, are at least absorbed. So that's my top level answer there.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say, there's a disconnect between the environmental justice movement and labor. There shouldn't be, but there is. And so I think that, you point out a big issue, that there needs to be more alignment in terms of how to move forward together, because it's exactly the members of the unions that live in, and many of them live in environmental justice communities. And so it's how to ensure that jobs, like I said, that the investments in infrastructure in our communities that are creating so many jobs, that those jobs are actually being accessed by community members. This is happening in live time. Like right now, we are working with multiple stakeholders on city and state level on figuring this out with the offshore wind investment that's happening as we speak, at South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. What are the jobs? What are the criteria and the qualifications and certification for all these different types of jobs, both direct and indirect? We want to plug in and make sure these investments, we're answering the questions of what are the gaps? What are the gaps in education and training and investments? And that's how we're building with multiple stakeholders these career pathways to ensure that the jobs are accessible. They're not just created, but they're accessible. And that those pathways are created now for jobs that are even come online 4 to 5 years down the line. So we're doing a lot of work on that, and happy to share more.
Thank you. Commissioner Thompson?
Hi, thank you so much for these presentations. When Sheila Foster mentioned microgrids and connecting schools or hospitals and others to residential housing or other things in communities that could help folks, it occurred to me that 2 hospitals in Brooklyn are building co-generators to generate electricity. And the Housing Authority is considering a new energy grid for public housing in Brownsville with 11 big complexes. But no one really seems to know where the pipes are, or even how to connect the pipes to other buildings, say if you wanted to do hot air or hot water in a grid. And I'm just using that as an example of, I think one of the panelists mentioned the need for capacity. I'm wondering if you all would suggest that the city create an agency, a new agency, explicitly focused on climate justice in order to enable the kinds of collaborations that you all are talking about. And I'll just say right now, the city has a sustainability office in the mayor's office. a resiliency office in the mayor's office, different office. But then other DCAS, Department of Administrative Services, has a piece of what happens in retrofitting. Department of Design and Construction has another piece. Department of Environmental Protection has another piece. And the Economic Development Corporation has another piece. And so I'm just wondering if you all would suggest that the city create something that, or do you think communities can actually navigate across all these things on their own as things are now?
So I think you just made the case for why we don't need another agency or office. And there are lots of them. They're hard enough to navigate, even for experts. So I'm on the New York City panel on climate change that works out of the Mayor's Office of Resiliency. That's a thick environment, and and if it's thick for the experts, it's thick for communities, right, to penetrate and to work with. A lot of what we've done, both on the last NPCC and on this one, is not just to bring communities to the table and to the process of co-designing and the programs that the cities are putting in place, like solar roof programs. One mistake that's often made is exactly that. It starts from some agency. A good idea is created, they put it in place, and then they go, oh, by the way, community, what do you think about this? And can you help us, put these solar panels on top of the buildings? Meanwhile, communities, the microgrid is not my idea, but We Act in Harlem has a whole climate action plan, which proposes microgrids, which has a whole idea and plan about how to create these microgrids, how to connect them to existing public buildings. So one of my ideas was a public community partnership. And the idea is to get away from the overly centralized top-down model that's operating now, but also not to romanticize, community-based stuff when there's no capacity or limited capacity or limited resources. You can't leave everything on communities either. You really do need a transfer of fiscal and other resources and a true partnership between the public sector and the community to come together, not for them to create and then to ask for participation at the back end. And there are models. I mean, part of our work is to have studied these models, not just all over the country, but all over the world, including, so one of the things that cities are doing is inventing, if you're going to invent something, invent a office of experimentation and put it out in the communities. Don't put it in City Hall. If you're going to invent something new, invent a space where the public and community actors can come together and co-design and come up with programs. Like, that's the innovation. It's not a new or another agency with experts that's top down. So I'll stop there.
I'll add, thank you so much for your comments. I want to add that something that I've observed again and again that is a complete missing piece to the existing agency, panels and structures, et cetera, are more literal funding opportunities to enable individuals, community-based groups to actually access these spaces and even hire experts to help do some of this analysis. One of the pieces, some states have something called intervenor compensation, where community groups and others can actually qualify to actually get funds from, say, the Public Service Commission to enable that petition in a Public Service Commission docket, because that issue that you and others alluded to in particular, it goes to the enormous challenges of building electrification and resilience in the built environment, where New York City is, of course, absolutely, I hate using these war analogies, ground zero, and how local these issues are, and how this, in particular, what you mentioned in terms of, how do you have not only that co-generation at that one plant, but why can't the hospital take over to across the street? These become sort of regulatory issues that end up being resolved or not resolved at, say, the Public Service Commission, which now has a lot of restrictions against specifically that type of development.
We're going to go until, if our panelists are able to stay with us until 4:05, we're going to go to 4:05. I know that Commission Member Louis Daniel Favors has a question, as does Commissioner Clay, forgive me. Laurie, please.
Yes, thank you so much, all of you, for powerful presentations and the information that you shared. You had mentioned, and at this point, I'm sorry, I've been taking notes, so I cannot quite remember who had said this, but there was discussion earlier about substantive rights as opposed to participation rights. And I believe it may have been, I'm not even going to pretend I remember who it was, but there was, okay, yes, Ms. Dr. Foster, thank you. There was some conversation about auditing capacity, which for me reminded me of issues related to community benefits agreements, which are designed to balance the power between groups that have an inequitable share of power. And yet I'm reminded when, for example, the Barclays Center went up, having a community benefits agreement without some automatic trigger really didn't do the community a lot of good if the community cannot afford to buy lawyers to go into court to ensure that the community benefit agreement terms are actually adhered to. What are your thoughts on creating triggers, automatic triggers that will relate to compliance? Because I envision a world where we do all of this work and it's amazing, and let's say it all works as we hope and plan and dream. If there's no enforcement mechanism that's put in place, no automatic trigger for punishment for harms that are inflicted or for violating the terms of in that example of community benefits agreements, we're sort of, we've got great words, we've got beautiful paper, but as Gail Noble says, it's a noble piece of paper without much substantive capacity. What are your thoughts on creating within whatever it is that we would be proposing as a result of this work, creating pathways for enforcement that do not require the community to organize in some meaningful way to be sure that we're going to actually see the benefits of the changes that we're hoping to make?
I mean, I will just say quite quickly that the problem with the CBAs is that the community is brought in as a counterweight to what is effectively a deal between the city and a private developer, right? And so you've got two problems. One problem is on the front end, is already that creates a inequality, right? Because traditionally, the developer has already approached the city. There's a development that's going to be done. Now you're telling communities to go in there and extract some benefits for yourself in a highly unequal. The other problem is once you have an agreement, as you say, on the back end, there's a lack of enforcement. So I stayed away from CBAs in my remarks exactly for this purpose. When I say substantive right, you say trigger, but when I say substantive right, I do think that there are a lot of participatory rights in the law right now. And when I say substantive right, I mean a right to, it could be a right to enforcement, it could be a set of penalties, a right, I said the right to the city, a right to access and to use and to claim community assets that are there, that are under the public authority. If you think about COVID, all the amazing opportunity we have in New York City with all this vacancy, to think creatively, right? And so the question is, from where should those ideas come from and who should be favored in those ideas? It's not bringing the community along. Again, after the deal is effectively done, after the program has been, right, that's the model now. But rather starting from there and then bringing the public resources and private where necessary, bringing those resources to the bottom, but to do it, to pool the resources with others. Communities can't do it alone, right? And CBAs expect them to, right? What I'm talking about is, no, it's a transfer of resources. And also these are community-led initiatives that then the public body supports and the resources support. And so the trigger, I think you need a substantive right to trigger going there first, right? And then putting the resources there and giving them power. And the right to the city is one model, but there are others, right?
I'm just going to jump in here and ask very quickly. We're going to hear from Commissioner Coy in just a minute, and he'll be our last commission member to ask the question. I'm going to, essentially hold off on my questioning and will likely follow up with you. But I would appreciate your sharing with us any jurisdictions, any municipalities, states where you see this work in action and believe that there are lessons that we can learn and examples that we can pull from. That would be very much helpful, especially with respect to right to city.
I can do that.
But from everyone, we appreciate that. Commission Member Coy.
My question is more for Sheila, because I really like the presentation about these rights and then the three components and the question my question is more along the line of like Commissioner Thompson, in terms of like is there some kind of a structure, where we can kind of really incorporate, whether it's like planning and development from a more citywide effort. So then we have all these different parts that we're talking about right now that could come out with a more of a comprehensive planning approach and development. Because right now, city planning really does not plan for the city. Technically, it's supposed to, but it doesn't. And then, so it's more reacting to projects that come before it, right? In terms of like you just mentioned, developer comes in and then have projects already decided pretty much, and then asking for certain changes, etc. So then, there may be some type of, I don't know. I think another agency. I know when I'm not suggesting another agency, but some kind of like form, where it could incorporate what you just mentioned.
Right.
That you have different stakeholders, and then looking at the interests of the city as a whole. That there's like a social value, from like where we cite projects to like say, what do we really need, in the next 5-10 years, whether it's affordable housing, etc. And then at the same time have that enforcement and veto power over some all projects or something, So then in that sense, there will be more fair negotiation, or getting the social benefit, which is being taken by mostly developers, private developers right now. Because I think the structure we have right now is really geared towards, the past approach of development from a private sector point of view. So that's my question. Whether do we need under that there's a czar some sort, really have power who can decide for the community or for the city as a whole the interest.
Right. So I'd like to hear from my other colleagues, but I would just say that there are models. I'm happy to pass it along. But one is our city labs, for instance, cities that want to move into the experimental space, like I talked about, but want to create a kind of Uber agency, but that has kind of non-experts, civic actors and people from communities. They have created a citywide lab where that work takes place. So that's one model. There are other models, policy innovation labs, new offices of civic innovation. So again, there are models around the world as well as in the US. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk with someone offline or pass along some of the research that I've done on that. And some of the work I've been involved in actually personally, both abroad as well as here in the US.
We're going to bring this panel to a close. Do very much appreciate all that you've shared, and just want to ask that you will take our call. We'll likely be calling again just to delve more deeply into specific ideas that you've presented. If there's additional information that we believe will be value add as we work through these ideas, we'd love to hear that. And as I shared just a moment ago, if there are specific municipalities or states where you think we can learn from them, good and bad, what to do and what not to do, we would very, very much appreciate that. But I, like the other commission members, appreciate all that you've shared and are encouraged. I'm encouraged, I should say, that you're in this fight and we want to join you in it. So thank you very much. We're going to move to the next panel. And three persons on the next panel are Melissa Iachán, Dustin Duncan, and Nicholas Bloom. Melissa Iachán is Senior Supervising Counsel in the Environmental Justice Program at NYLPI, where she supervises the legal work of the environmental justice team and advocates to improve access and equity for vulnerable low-income communities and communities of color. Before joining the organization, she worked for the City of New York at the Mayor's Office and at the New York City Business Integrity Commission. Dustin Duncan is an Associate Professor of Epidemiology at Columbia University's Mellon School of Public Health and Director of the Columbia Spatial Epidemiology Lab. Dr. Duncan is a social and spatial epidemiologist studying how neighborhood characteristics and mobility across geographic contexts influence population health and disparity and health disparities. His intersectional research focuses on Black, gay, bisexual, and other sexual minority men and transgender women of color. Nicholas Bloom is professor of urban policy and planning at Hunter College. His research analyzes long-term planning outcomes in essential urban systems such as subsidized housing and mass transportation. He's the author of Public Housing That Worked and co-editor of 4 edited collections. His current research explores how the demise of America's once excellent bus transit systems damaged the quality of life of all Americans and contributed to the rise of today's highly segregated metropolis. We will begin with Melissa Iachán. Please begin, and you have 8 minutes. We'll hear from you each, and then we'll talk to our panelists, and then we're going to take a break. But I'm sorry, we'll talk to the commission members. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to speak very quickly because I have a lot to say. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to present to you today. As was just introduced, my name is Melissa Iachán, and I am Senior Supervising Counsel for Environmental Justice at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. NYLPI is a nonprofit civil rights legal organization who, for more than 40 years, has advocated for equality and justice for all New Yorkers to defeat bias and barriers based on race, poverty, disability, and immigration status. NYLPI's EJ program was founded in response to grassroots community organizing, decrying the inequitable distribution of environmental burdens in our city. Today, more than 3 decades after our EJ program was established, we continue our advocacy alongside our community partners to try and advance more equitable distribution of both benefits and burdens to human health and environment in New York City. Since our inception of the program, supporting and responding to community needs because of disproportionate health and environmental impacts, the environmental racism in the city has only persisted and grown. What we refer to now as sacrifice zones are prevalent throughout our city. In the historically Black and brown communities where we see a disproportionate amount of polluting infrastructure sited. Not surprisingly, these same communities have below average access to green space, suffer more acutely from urban heat island effects, have higher incidence of asthma emergencies, and of course, were much more affected by serious hospitalizations and death during the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite some attempts to bring equity into siting of polluting infrastructure, and despite the charter having been revised 3 decades ago to incorporate principles of fair share, these inequities persist. For example, despite progress made in expanding access to parks under the last 2 mayors, communities of color currently have 33.5% less park space within a 10-minute walk per person than white communities. A brief case study that is illustrative relates to our waste processing system in the city, which is a huge environmental justice challenge that NYLPI has worked on for decades. For decades, more than 75% of our city's waste was trucked into and out of only 3 neighborhoods, the South Bronx, Southeast Queens, and North Brooklyn. These communities are the same places where polluting power plants and generators requiring exemptions to Clean Air Act regulations are sited, where bus and truck depots are clustered, where cement plants spew dust and particulate matter into the air, and where almost centuries-old wastewater treatment plants dominate the waterfront, spewing noxious smells into the surrounding neighborhoods. In 2006, the city undertook an attempt to come up with a comprehensive solid waste management plan, or SWAMP, with the goal of reducing the reliance on these inequitably sited truck-intensive waste facilities clustered in only 4 community districts. 12 years later, in response to continued advocacy led by the impacted communities, still suffering the negative consequences of the clustering of the waste facilities and corresponding garbage, truck traffic, and air pollution, the City Council fulfilled some of the promise of the SWAMP by passing the Waste Equity Law, or Local Law 152, which reduced the amount of waste that facilities in the overburdened community districts could process. This is modest relief, but it is impermanent. Only last week, the council came moments away from voting on a bill that proposed to undo the reductions in the waste equity law by allowing certain facilities in the overburdened districts to once again increase the amount of waste they could process. Thankfully, after outcry and organizing from the impacted communities, this bill was pulled minutes before the Sanitation Committee was scheduled to convene the vote on it. What is needed today is a meaningful commitment to begin to implement solutions that could have and should have passed more than a decade ago, and ensuring that they are codified into the charter of our city. We need more than mere symbolic rhetoric being added to the city charter noting the importance of racial equity. We are looking for real tools to assist overburdened communities and the city as a whole in advancing equity in a meaningful way. Today, I will name 5 primary ways to amend the city charter in order to center equity and reduce environmental and health burdens on our historically overburdened communities. First, fix the fair share in the city charter. Fair share is currently provided for in sections 203 and 204 of the charter are ineffective as is. For example, fair share statements are not currently, as a matter of routine, shared with the public, even when they are released. Further, unless a siting of a facility has to go through ULURP, there is still insufficient opportunity for community input, and many of these facilities are cited outside of the ULURP process. Finally, an example of facilities cited outside of ULURP is emergency contracting. This has been overutilized, allowing agencies to altogether skip public review and thorough analysis of facility siting. What must be done? First, prohibit unfair sightings in highly overconcentrated districts. The charter must prohibit city agencies from citing facilities in highly overconcentrated districts unless the agency can pass a much higher bar than the current fair share analysis requires, which is simply an explanation of the decision. The CPC should also publicly review and vote on facility sightings in districts that are the most overconcentrated with that specific facility type, with the ability to receive public testimony. An agency should only be able to overcome this prohibition by demonstrating that the facility in question serves a particular need of that community district's residents or workers. For further details on how to actually put this into action and give it teeth, Intro 544 of 2018, a city council bill, does a good job.
I'm just going to interrupt you just for a second. I really appreciate the details, but we can actually, if you can provide us with the document, your written remarks, then we can delve into the details. So if you can just stick right now, I just want to make sure that we hear from everyone to the 5 key issue areas.
So the second part of updating fair share is to mandate that the fair share criteria, which should be updated every 5 years, are actually binding rules rather than guidelines, because currently courts view this criteria as mere guidelines and therefore almost always will give deferential discretion to the agency. By changing the criteria to rules, plaintiffs challenging inequitably cited facilities would have more of the ability to have leverage and challenging the agency decision. So that is the fair share piece. The second piece is comprehensive long-term planning codified in the charter. Communities of color have been deprived of meaningful participation in land use, zoning, and development decisions in our city for too long. Under Mayor Bloomberg, preference was given to wealthy white communities in his down zoning initiatives. And under Mayor de Blasio, the ambition to create massive amounts of affordable housing has resulted in ramming through upzonings and development growth in communities of color without adequate community notice and input. There is currently no applicable citywide rationale for consistently approving land use proposals. In order to truly center principles of equity and public participation in our land use processes citywide and ensure enforceable equity goals in zoning and development, we need a citywide comprehensive long-term plan. Here I also cite 3 sections of the charter, which I will pass along in my written testimony. But the idea is to have a more holistic assessment of the city's entire need for housing, including supportive, transitional, and affordable housing, as well as public facilities and neighborhood amenities. This comprehensive plan will allow the city to plan for the city's long-term needs, as well as cite schools, open space, infrastructure, and services to meet those needs citywide and in specific districts. The targets should be generated and shared with communities and at the very outset, and also end with the communities. Also involved should be elected representatives. Further, a comprehensive long-term plan could operate with both equity and resiliency planning at its core, allowing the city to move closer towards its goals of incorporating sustainability in the midst of our climate crisis and taking into account the most vulnerable communities to the impacts of climate change. The third recommendation that I am making today is seeker reform. The seeker and EIS process should be modified to take into account primary and secondary displacement, which it currently doesn't, track neighborhood outcomes after land use decisions are approved for lessons learned, and require mitigation in those areas where significant adverse impacts are identified with enforcement. Additionally, the seeker technical manual must be mandated to be regularly reviewed and updated and subject to public review and input. It's currently 12 years out of date. Number 4 is community board reform.
Okay, we're out of time, so what I just want you to do is to give me the 2 additional items, and then we can come back either in Q&A. I just want to honor other people's time, and I also want your full, your written remarks. That would be very helpful.
Sure. Number 4 is community board reform, and number 5 is incorporate local law 60 of 2017 into the charter, mandating EJ analysis with the passage of every law, issuance of every permit, and promulgation of every rule.
Excellent. Okay, we'll be back to you. I appreciate you providing us with your remarks. Let us now hear from Professor Dustin Duncan.
Thank you very much. It is my distinct honor and privilege to speak before the New York City Racial Justice Commission today. My name is Dr. Dustin Duncan. I'm a tenured associate professor of epidemiology at Columbia University, where I co-direct the department's social and spatial epidemiology unit and direct the Columbia Spatial Epidemiology Lab. As a social and spatial epidemiologist, I'll provide my perspective based on my and others' research on structural changes, including those rooted in city planning, to promote racial justice and reduce health disparities. It is clear that New York City, like many other cities, is segregated, including racially. And many studies, including my studies, demonstrate that neighborhoods can have an enduring impact on the health and well-being of residents, impacting health disparities. Due to our short time together today, I decided to focus my need for public, safe recreation open spaces, including safe parks and playgrounds across New York City neighborhoods. Many studies show that public recreational open spaces can influence health outcomes and health behaviors, including promoting physical activity and reducing depression, just to name a few. In addition, many studies show also that neighborhood safety concerns can impact health, including physical activity and depression, again, but also other health outcomes and health behaviors. At the neighborhood level, studies not surprisingly show that neighborhood amenities can have non-equitable distribution, and often do, including safe public recreation open spaces. My respectful, but strong recommendation is creating equitable, safe public open spaces across New York City. What does this mean, and what could this mean? This could mean public policy interventions, and in particular, modifying urban and density zoning laws. A proposed land use ideal is a neighborhood, including minority neighborhoods, should have at least 10% of that neighborhood land dedicated to open spaces. I encourage that these open spaces are built from the crime prevention through environmental design principles, including changes to the physical environment, such as eliminating hiding spots, landscaping trees and shrubs, and increased surveillance via lighting, closed circuit television, surveillance cameras in public spaces, and security guards. I conclude my comments here and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Very, very much appreciated. The last person from whom we'll hear is Professor Nicholas Blum.
Hi, good morning, or good afternoon, I'm sorry. And I'm honored to be here. And Dustin, we should talk, by the way, on the open space. I think that's very interesting. So I'm going to talk briefly. I have some prepared comments about the role of the New York City Housing Authority and the charter reform. I have a modest charter reform proposal for that. So when it comes to maintaining diversity in New York's public spaces and neighborhoods, there's no greater priority than stabilizing the New York City Housing Authority. On NYCHA campuses, even in elite areas like Chelsea and the Upper West Side, it's still possible for low-income people of color, who compose 95% of the approximately 360,000 current NYCHA residents, to sit on a bench or just hang out without buying anything, to party on family days, enjoy extensive NYC Park and NYCHA recreational facilities. These are often the largest green spaces in their neighborhoods, gather in community and senior centers, and to gain access to nearby jobs, transit, and other community resources. More affluent New Yorkers may turn up their noses at public housing, the institutional, brick towers in the park, so forth, but approximately 166,000 families still seek a NYCHA apartment, which run on average just $558 per month, which is remarkable. Sadly, this engine for neighborhood diversity is in distress. The combination of aging infrastructure, 175 out of 302 developments are 50 years or older, low rents and shrinking federal subsidies have led to a minimum $40 billion capital need for renovation. The state government mostly abandoned NYCHA decades ago, and the federal government, despite once funding NYCHA at a higher level, today refuses to fund public housing at an adequate level. Many NYCHA initiatives have tried to address the scale of this crisis. Triage maintenance programs, staff reductions, rent increases, private sector renovation and management under RAD, board reorganization, tighter mayoral control, and occasional one-offs of federal, city, and state aid. And I'm getting old enough that I've seen it all now at this point. While there are small victories here and there are new roofs, some Sandy redesigns, there are some creative RAD designs, The evidence of the overall failure to stop the downhill slide was the 2019 HUD-NYCHA consent decree and the federal monitorship requiring the city government to begin investing in public housing to deal with lead, mold, elevators, and other quality of life issues. The environmental quality of NYCHA developments has declined significantly, both in apartments and on the grounds. The total of $4.3 billion in city capital commitments for NYCHA in the current 10-year capital plan, 2022 to 2031, is unprecedented and will make a difference, but pales in comparison to the immediate and long-term need. The proposed blueprint for change out of NYCHA leadership to create a public housing preservation trust to speed renovation also remains stalled in Albany. So why isn't the city government taking a more proactive role in stabilizing NYCHA, especially given the crucial role played by these developments in maintaining diversity in public spaces and neighborhoods? Well, history provides the answer. Since 1934, when NYCHA started operations, the city of New York has benefited from below market public housing with a minimum of public city budget dollars, thanks to the combination of federal and some state subsidies plus tenant rents. The city has provided tax exemption for NYCHA properties and once provided a modest stipend for what were city funded projects. The city on a whole gained a great deal of below market housing for very little direct outlay. Remarkably little funding, city funding has gone to create this vast system that today even houses 370,000 official residents and is 7.8% of the city's total renting stock. So state and federal action has been a more powerful force at NYCHA for almost a century. The state government, responding to a housing reform pressure back in the 1930s, created NYCHA as a local semi-independent intermediary for local, state, and federal housing funds. Because of deep distrust of local government, reformers viewed a freestanding housing authority staffed by career professionals and civil servants as the best way to handle a flood of federal and state cash, as well as other complex housing functions like land clearance and tenant selection. So-called independence of NYCHA made sense when the federal and state governments were generous funders of public housing. The mayor appointed NYCHA leadership from the beginning, but as a minor funder, NYCHA was not a central part of the city budget. And NYCHA is not now and has not been a city department, as the charter indicates. This arm's length arrangement has run its course. If New York is to have quality public housing in the future and sustain neighborhood and public diversity citywide, it's probably going to have to fund more of public housing operations than capital needs. So how do we begin to fund NYCHA locally? A crucial step and major statement of civic priorities would be changing the charter. NYCHA is mentioned only briefly in the city charter, has no section of its own, and is vaguely denoted compared to city departments like HPD, DOT, etc. This oversight in the charter is intentional, given the origins of NYCHA in state law and the primary reliance on federal funds and rents to the present, but must be corrected if NYCHA is to be adequately funded at the local level. The integration of NYCHA into the city government as a department is one solution the Charter Commission should consider. The mayor of New York, thanks to state legislation, already appoints a chair and the NYCHA board and thus controls policy. But without direct budget responsibility, this control, no matter how well-intentioned, is unable to resolve the crisis. Separate Department of Public Housing or just integrating NYCHA itself is now needed to give the renovation effort a fair chance of success. NYCHA leaders, as other agency heads do, should be able to make a case for their ongoing expenses, operating funds, and capital needs, state of good repair. NYCHA's inclusion as a typical department of the city charter would hopefully establish a more consistent and sizable operating capital budget for NYCHA. Additional funding will attract talent to NYCHA and thus improve the quality of life for tenants. NYCHA as a city department would also be a more creative partner with city agencies like HPD, which is already involved in NYCHA's RAD initiatives, NYC Parks, which already runs many parks on NYCHA grounds, and there are plans for more. And I referenced to Dustin's talking about improving park spaces. I think NYCHA is a tremendous opportunity there, as well as other social service departments and schools that have relationship with NYCHA one way or another. There are also many creative opportunities for making best use of NYCHA resources to make a more equitable city, including long overdue experiments in co-housing, community land trust, community mental health, additional city parks on NYCHA grounds, and new models of senior housing. NYCHA as a city department would also take some of the pressure off partial privatization of the portfolio under RAD. It would also reduce pressure for infill that will lead to loss of green space and trees needed in neighborhoods that often have insufficient natural resources. Even redevelopment of public housing developments would probably proceed in a more equitable and creative manner if under direct city control. I know the challenges to integrating NYCHA into city government charter are tremendous. State and federal government would have to sign off on this. Laws will have to be changed. Voters citywide would have to endorse directly helping public housing residents, which they haven't seen so far. The capital and operating needs of NYCHA, if funded at the needed levels, could easily push other important priorities aside. After all, the total 10-year capital budget for the city as a whole is $133 billion. Fully funding NYCHA's renovation could easily absorb 1/3 of that amount. To finance NYCHA fully, therefore, also might require new forms of taxation. Yet I would say waiting on a NYCHA ferry for politicians to fund NYCHA without a local mandate, or pretending that a $40 billion capital need is not impacting tenant quality of life, has been a disaster. It's odd that NYCHA's continuing crisis failed to gain traction as a central equity and planning issue. I cannot figure it out. Billions are promised for new prisons, supportive and affordable housing, many other equity first priorities, all of which are worthwhile causes. Yet at the same time, in the present, many NYCHA tenants continue to endure substandard conditions. The potential loss of these public housing communities and the people who live in them will create even more segregated neighborhoods and public spaces. And that's the end of my formal comments, but I would note you can look at public housing redevelopment in most other cities in America to see what happens when the towers come down, right, in terms of equity. So,
Hey, thank you. There is one other panelist who we are hoping will join us for this panel, or rejoin us, Michelle De La Ruz. But why don't we move to questions right now? And then if she comes back, then we will engage with her directly. Commission members, any questions? You may have stumped us. We'll begin with Commissioner Hamilton, Garrett Hamilton.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. And my query is directed at Mr. Bloom. I like a lot of what you said. I think New York is kind of uniquely, at least in my perception, positioned in that a lot of low income housing is placed in locations that might not see people from lower income backgrounds otherwise residing. And you definitely give us the issues with regards to funding. So I'm wondering also, New York is also perhaps one of the places that stands out with regards to housing cost and values in general. Mm-hmm. And you presented the problem with a funding stream given the constraints on local budgets. Is there any creative finances that can link to our growing housing values in general that could promote equitable inclusion as it relates to NYCHA? Can you think of some model, some access to finance as it relates to that growing housing value in New York City in general?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure it's partially related to the tremendous value, I suppose, and the interest generally of finance in New York City. But I mean, this trust or the Preservation Trust for Public Housing is one of these, just like RAD, is looking to kind of leverage, future federal subsidies to help renovate public housing. I think the issue here that I see is politically, as you probably know, you can tell, right? There's growing resistance, at least in a lot of quarters, against relying on private sector financing for renovation of public housing, right? I mean, it's even though, and it sort of played out in this election a little bit, but there is growing concern that, once you bring the private sector, for instance, into either the financing structure or even the management structure of public housing, certain qualities of public housing which people appreciated could be lost, right? That is, for instance, NYCHA, even though it puts a lot of people into the eviction process, doesn't actually dispossess that many tenants, right? Private sector, not so much. So I would say if the city government wants true public housing with really very stable tenancy, long-term preservation, and low rents, right? I don't see an option beyond tapping additional tax revenues. Because the other side of it, obviously, yes, there's a lot of proposals out there, right, for redeveloping NYCHA, for putting the private sector in there, right, to do the management. It's already happening.
Yeah.
Right?
Now I'm with you. I guess I'm proposing: is there any structural way to tie that taxation into the housing value that keeps appreciating?
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying more broadly, like that's beyond my area, like taxation. But certainly there are opportunities for very creative ways for a kind of value added component to basically go to NYCHA. Again, that would take a number of very smart lawyers and accountants to sit down in a room, right, and figure out how that additional, let's call it the under increment, could go to public housing. Certainly, if the political, I believe, having lived long enough, I believe if the political will is there to save this resource, people will come up with, alternative financing strategies. You can look at the MTA this way, right? I mean, from, basically using tunnels to fund transit, right? When the political will is there, somebody will figure out a way to do it. Sorry.
I am going to ask our fourth panelist, who hasn't had an opportunity to speak, and she will share some remarks in just a minute. It was my oversight, and so I'm glad that she's joined us or rejoined us. She actually, though, wants to jump on in and answer this question. So please respond. And this is Michelle De La Uz, who leads the Fifth Avenue Corporation. Please.
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciate being here, and I'll be happy to do the testimony later. But on this point, I'll just say that Fifth Avenue Committee worked with the Pratt Center for Community Development and David Rosen and Associates to do an analysis of the land value appreciation or increase as a result of the proposed Gowanus area-wide rezoning, with the goal of trying to capture a portion of that to help address the nearly $300 million capital needs gap at 2 public housing developments in Gowanus. So if you're interested in that analysis, I'll follow up and send you guys links. Basically we found that the value capture potential was between 100 million and close to $1 billion. So absolutely able to address the local needs. So that, I think, speaks to Professor Hamilton's question very specifically. And there are a number of folks who are looking at that issue more broadly.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Commission Member Thompson's hand, and then we'll go to Commission Member and Vice Chair Garrido.
I very much appreciate the raising the issue of value recapture, and I'm not aware of a whole lot of research on this. I do know that Bogota, Colombia, London, some other cities take a portion of the upside whenever they do a city park or transit stop. Real estate values go up, and they take anywhere from 20 to 70% of the upside and redirect it for low-income housing. But I'm not aware of any studies that kind of draw together these models. So I'd be curious if any of the panelists know of any resources we could learn more about. But I also wanted to ask Professor Bloom, why would he not frame the public housing issue as a national reparations issue? Because the federal government constructed property inequality through 200 million acres in land, essentially giveaways for white folks, through the whole way HUD, or the predecessor to HUD, created redlining, to the way GI benefits were handed out disproportionately, 0 inches VA loans, et cetera, to enable whites to buy houses at very low income or no money down, et cetera. A lot of what we're talking about here is actually a federal product in terms of homelessness and lack of housing and lack of affordability. So why wouldn't we press the federal government to do reparations, as opposed to saying local taxpayers should bear that burden?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess for one thing, I was asked to comment on the city charter. My concerns about that. I think you have to walk and chew gum at the same time with this particular issue. And yes, there's no question that federal policy and even the way public housing itself was shaped, right? And there were basically a lot of racist goals sort of embedded in it. I guess there's a couple reasons why I think it's dangerous as a national issue. One is public housing, I don't believe, is really a vibrant national policy anymore. So when it comes to what we keep seeing, year in, year out, I know there are proposals out there for funding public housing, New Deal for public housing and so forth, but it's very hard to generate national support, even on an issue like, let's say, a very strong basis of reparations for what has become a disproportionately New York-centric institution. I mean, you can look at other cities, right? And they have drastically reduced their portfolio. Look at Chicago, right? Baltimore and so forth. So I actually think it doesn't play very well as a national issue compared, for instance, something like mortgage access, right? I think there's much more. Whereas New York has 160,000 units out of, maybe 1 million left of public housing units in the country. So I think the city does have to reckon with the idea that this is something that is unique to New York, the scale of the transit system, also, disproportionately large to the rest of the country. But there are many more active transit systems, I think, in the US that help create that national push. So I guess my feeling is we can wait for the federal government to take these actions, but why should people have to suffer while we wait for the federal government to do the right thing? I believe that through taxation or realigning funding, quality of life for NYCHA residents could be improved significantly in the short term, while this larger fight for basically equity and reparations takes place at the federal level.
Appreciate that. Very much appreciate that. Henry? Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be quick. The first question is for Mr. Duncan, if he's still around. Want to ask if his proposal about the 10% for ULURP was prospectively, or does it include an analysis, a retroactive analysis, what's today? And secondly, whether you have looked at the current setup and ascertained how much that would mean in the future, because density is an issue here in New York.
That's a good question. Sorry, I should have clarified. A couple things. More so that there should be some type of minimum, and I just kind of proposed 10% of making sure that there's some type of public recreational open space across every neighborhood, and just suggesting that a lot of research shows that higher income and particularly white neighborhoods have open spaces and safe open spaces. I didn't do any analysis given the kind of the time and the request to see kind of the distribution of the open spaces across New York City and what will be needed. But in a follow-up, I can have our group run those analyses to see what's feasible within the context of New York City. But I guess the kind of overall thesis is that there should be some type of promise, dedication to a land space for each neighborhood, and hopefully by having some minimum, it could begin the conversation of having some type of equity in terms of every neighborhood having access to open space.
Thank you. I think my question now ties to Ms. Lackham about the fact that, let's say we follow, Mr. Duncan's idea of set aside a percentage, right? We have seen that in the application of the access of those people of color have less access to parks. And even when they do, I represent the New York City park rangers. And when you compare the PEP officers that are doing services in Central Park through a conservancy and compare them to, say, Inglewood, right? Or the park that's not far from where I am, the vast differences in application of existing resources. So I think you've suggested some of the ideas that the charter can begin to look at it, but I need a clarification on something you said about, because we've heard from previous panels say, we don't need another panel. We don't need another agency. We didn't need another enforcement. We don't need yet another thing. And I think Deputy Mayor Thompson mentioned is, even when you have this well-intentioned idea, you have multiple layers of people. So can you clarify to me, when you were talking about how do we begin to dismantle this disproportionate resource distribution within our society?
Was that question directed to me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, thank you. So, I mean, I think the question is, if it's essentially what we're all talking about here. How do we begin to dismantle the disproportionate benefits and burdens, right? I think.
But let me just, I wanna push you on this, would be specific to the charter, right? I think I'm not, naive enough to think that a charter revision is gonna undo, decades of institutional inequities, right? But right now, you've looked at the charter and made specific references to the charter where that exists. And that's where I want to pressure you.
Yeah, so I think actually a couple of the suggestions I made could help with that and dovetail with what Dustin suggested as well. For example, mandating a comprehensive long-term plan for the city as a whole in terms of how it intends to utilize its land use and the goals that it is going to set, such as 10% of land in every community district shall be set aside for open space, and having that be the long-term plan. And of course, in developing that long-term plan, community input has to be at the forefront, because you can't treat every community as the same. And so telling every community that they need 10% to be used as open space may not necessarily be what the communities want, but that's an example of something that you could absolutely put in the long-term plan. And then when the ULURPs or the smaller, land use applications come in, they have to be held to the goals or to the long-term plan. And if they're not meeting those goals or the values or determinations that the communities came together and approved as part of the long-term plan, a much higher explanation to explain why they're not meeting that needs to be put forth before that rezoning or particular land use application can even move through the process. And so I think that is one way to modify the charter, by requiring this comprehensive long-term plan. I mean, you think about the comprehensive long-term plans that the city has. I referred to the solid waste management plan, which is a 20-year plan about handling our waste, which is required by the state. And then we also have a long-term energy plan, which the Mayor's Office of Sustainability is currently developing in partnership with a lot of us stakeholders. And so there are long-term plans for specific areas, and they're all kind of happening in independent vacuums and parallel universes. And there isn't a comprehensive plan that also takes into account the need for housing, the need for open space, and equity. With equity and racial justice at its core, a comprehensive long-term plan could really go a long way at accomplishing a lot of the things that we're talking about here today.
Thank you.
Very helpful. I am going to turn now to Michelle De La Uz, who is the Executive Director of the Fifth Avenue Committee, Inc. and Neighbors Helping Neighbors. She oversees the organization's mission and comprehensive programs, all that serve more than 5,500 low and moderate income people here in New York City. She serves on the National Board of Directors of LISC, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, the New York Housing Conference, and the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, among many other groups and organizations. She was appointed to serve as the City Planning Commissioner on the New York City Planning Commission from 2012 to 2021, and that alone might get you many questions, Michelle, if you would share with us some of your thoughts and reflections in this moment.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to the commissioners. I know what it's like to sit on the other side and listen to a bunch of testimony and try to figure out how to parse it out and figure out where the nuggets are to move forward. I'll just say that equity happens intentionally. It doesn't happen by mistake. And that, the challenge in New York City is, are we focused on growth or are we focused on equity? I don't believe that's an either or situation. I believe inclusive growth is possible. I think Melissa just mentioned a number of different plans that the city has. And depending on who's putting it out, one might be more focused on growth and another might be more focused on equity. And I think overall, and this was said by a number of the speakers, that, equity is really a societal obligation, and we all have to contribute to furthering it. In terms of, this is going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I too believe that we need a comprehensive plan, a long-term plan, where the challenges that the city faces, either regard to inclusion, racial inclusion, undoing segregation, undoing the effects of redlining, undoing the effects of urban renewal in various communities, addressing climate change, and quite honestly, the coordination that's needed across multiple city agencies to achieve these goals, that is absolutely necessary. Right now, about 90% of all development in the city is being done as of right. And in a lot of communities, it's being done based on zoning that was in place from the 1960s. The world has changed a lot. I was born in the 60s, and the world has changed a lot. And it's really important that a long-term plan that really takes into account current challenges, current goals, are taken, are really put in place. And it's also really important, honestly, that we connect our land use policy with our capital budget in the city, and that we also, of course, think about investing in people and communities. I also heard the need for secret reform. I believe in that as well. There's, I think the biggest challenge that a lot of communities have about the environmental review process is that it seems very distant to them, and it seems as though it doesn't address current concerns, and that's because it really hasn't been updated. I know from my experience and the experience of Fifth Avenue Committee, for years we've been most concerned about how secret treated rent stabilized housing and assumed that it was not under threat and that those tenants were not able to be displaced. And I can tell you certainly from direct experience of organizing rent stabilized tenants that they can be. Although, luckily the changes in the rent stabilization law a few years ago helped to make that more difficult. One of the questions that I was asked to touch on really was about structural roadblocks. Honestly, I don't know that. I think the biggest roadblocks are really about political will, and about ensuring that there is the ability to focus on these things, even when there's a lot of opposition. Obviously, Fifth Avenue Committee and other folks are in the middle of a dialogue about rezoning Gowanus. That will be the first neighborhood under the de Blasio administration that's a majority white neighborhood where the median income is close to $150,000 for the 62% of white residents. And there's significant opposition to the rezoning and a lot of misinformation going on, despite the fact that that rezoning will result in 35% of all the units, about 3,000 units, being affordable to low and moderate income folks, majority of folks of color. And we're looking forward to the independent racial equity report that will be released very soon, that I'll make sure that you all can have a link to and get a chance to review it. I think the other thing I'll just say as part of the testimony is, organizations like Fifth Avenue Committee and like AFI, the organization that Chris used to run, and others, we're part of like a critical part of the civic infrastructure that really needs to be invested in. A lot of times people talk about community participating in processes. I'll just say that in order to make that meaningful, you often need trusted liaisons between government and community who can decode what is going on in these conversations. We do an entire educational series we call the Community Development Series. We've developed with groups like Center for Urban Pedagogy and others, where we do popular education in multiple languages. I'll just point out about what is zoning, what is affordable housing, what is environmental review, all of these things to make it much more accessible to people. And I'll just share one anecdote. A couple of years ago when we did it, we literally had folks as young as 10 years old in the room and as old, in their 70s. And I'll just say, including an elected official, a state elected official who had been in office for quite a long time. And at the end, all of those folks were able to participate in these sessions. And at the end of the session, the elected official said, I appreciate so much what you did. I finally, someone explained to me like the interaction between area median income and affordable housing finance. And now I get it. Like, if you want communities to meaningfully participate in these discussions, you have to provide the education and tools, the technical assistance in order for that to happen. And that is what like true democracy looks like. And yeah, so I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer a bunch of questions. I'll just say, FACT develops and manages affordable housing. We help market affordable housing. We currently have an affordable housing development pipeline of 1,900 units, and absolutely understand the interaction between land use policy, affordable housing, finance, and addressing community concern and need.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here first. Thank you all for your presentations. And I want to lean in on the, I guess what was maybe your last comment, and ask you all to respond or to join in concerning the last comment about, I guess, knowledge and capacity building. We as a commission have talked about the importance of that, that very often we may have a situation where we're bringing about changes in law, bringing about reforms, but we're missing a critical link for people who for so long have been denied, deprived of the ability to meaningfully engage. And that is, ensuring that they are supported to engage. And so I want to lean in a little bit more on that and ask your thoughts about what that might look like.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I think in the current model, right, that we have for at least land use, right, we have community boards. They don't have any technical assistance, right? I mean, they don't have the resources to, and oftentimes they're asked very technical questions, and they rely on the volunteers that participate in those community boards. That's not a recipe for success, right? I think you need to, teach this kind. If we really want civic participation, if we really want communities to have a say in these processes and to meaningfully contribute, then we absolutely have to think of this as a civic academy type approach that is resourced, but is also local. And there are definitely models. And like I said, the Center for Urban Pedagogy in New York City is a great resource. Love working with them. Obviously, groups like Pratt Center for Community Development, groups like Hester Street, all of them, I think, are very well versed in this area.
Well, I would say that the opportunity to rethink NYCHA as a true city agency would hopefully lead to a complete rethinking of the current kind of resident engagement policies, which were set by the federal government decades ago, which, quite frankly, don't really work. And just to go with Michelle's point, I mean, I think rethink kind of like how people participate, what they know about NYCHA, how they talk about NYCHA and in these communities, and really make such a strong case for the value of these places. But yeah, I think that there is a real opportunity to rethink the resident governance model in public housing. I see Michelle saying yes, certainly, yeah. And that could be a really creative and powerful element of bringing.
Well, the first thing is that people can't be. It's not tenure, right? It's not an appointment for life, right?
Right. That would be a good change, right? Yes. I'll stop there.
Let's see. Commissioner Hamilton has a question.
So, I appreciate and like all the focus on NYCHA, which I agree is kind of unique to New York in being integrative in ways that other cities aren't with regards to people from certain demographic groups. But can we think about the other end as well? Are there structures in the city that allow for protectionism and discriminatory exclusion in housing, perhaps at the high end? I guess any thoughts on the co-op model, for example, the ability to use discretion in ways that might be immune to some housing discrimination laws? And any insights or thoughts on that?
For me, the co-op model, you're right that it can be. The issue for low and moderate income folks isn't necessarily that they're being discriminated. In my experience, based on the co-op model, it's that the high cost of entry, like having the ability to have the down payment. Like, one of the things, Fifth Avenue Committee and our affiliate Neighbors Helping Neighbors, NHN is a HUD certified counseling agency, so we do first-time homebuyer counseling and foreclosure counseling. The most of our folks have credit scores over 700. They're moderate income folks, 80, even $100,000 a year, but they don't, they don't come from wealth. And so they haven't accumulated the funds for down payment. And when the median cost of a home in Brooklyn is close to $900,000, that's the barrier to entry, not that the co-op board is not going to approve you. At least that's been our experience.
I mean, I'm more focused, again, with this particular proposal on the sort of quality of life of people who are currently in NYCHA and potential residents of NYCHA. And so sort of piggybacking on Michelle's point, I mean, gaining access to cooperatives for middle income families can be very difficult because of the high requirement for down payment or partial payment. But I don't have anything to add. Does anyone?
My 2 cents is that other things also are exclusionary, such as the use of landmarking and preservation. And that has also resulted in a lot of exclusionary and discriminatory sort of impact. And it's not a popular opinion. Maybe it's more popular in this group than in normal groups.
It also means that it shifts development to areas where that doesn't exist.
Right.
And some of that landmarking has happened in transit-rich areas as well, which from a planning perspective makes no sense.
You good, Derek? Okay. It looks like Commissioner Coy has another question. I'm not sure, Commissioner Thompson, if you're still raising your hand or if that's a holdover.
No, I have a question for Michelle, because I know that we actually had another panel. There was somebody one of the panelists mentioned about talking about how like the city planning chair is also the director of the city planning, and how, also whether there should be 2 separate positions. And then also that, that there was a lot of response in terms of when community organization goes up and talk about giving comments and response to some projects, and then the city planning staff would say that we're race neutral. So we can, really look at anything from that lens, we're neutral. So I just want to ask your opinion in terms of like, whether there should be like two separate roles, and then also even within the city planning department and commission is like, should that be as two separate even agencies or entity where one would be really focusing on true planning and development, and then looking at larger kind of like city needs in terms of infrastructure, housing, not just about housing. So, and then also put a racial lens to that.
That's a great question, Chris. I mean, obviously you have the perspective too, having, when you said on city planning, I would just say, I would be more focused on developing the comprehensive plan, the long-term plan, and then figuring out what is the appropriate agency or staffing structure to support its implementation. I think sometimes we get too focused on, modifying, making small adjustments to the current way things are being done, rather than like having a more radical transformation that will kind of lead to the change we really want to see. So I would rather kind of focus on implementing the plan. Yeah, I mean, the current structure, what it does help to address, I think, is some of the coordination issues. But there are larger interagency coordination issues that also need to be addressed, not just between the City Planning Commission and the Department of City Planning.
But right now it seems like there's no entity that actually does anything or has influence or power or resources to kind of conduct that kind of like larger long-term
No,
planning.
that's absolutely right. It would have to be created.
Yeah.
Right. It would have to be created.
And I would just point out from a historical point of view, there's a reason why, there isn't a comprehensive plan, in part because the last major attempt was in the 1960s, and the politics of a comprehensive plan are they're not minor in any way. It makes my NYCHA proposal look like nothing. Like these are, because again, you've seen this recent election, right? The notion, everyone thinks, well, people will think like me and they'll want this progressive vision or whatever it is, right, for this area. But it's a very diverse city in terms of politics and outlook. And it is likely to be a very long and contentious process, which is one reason I think why it has remained as an aspiration of certain groups rather than being in the chart.
Right. Well, one of the things we're appreciating with this work is that the kind of the tinkering on the edges doesn't really get us.
Yeah, that's fair.
Right. And so we have to push beyond.
It hasn't moved the needle, especially as it relates to racial equity and justice.
And certainly NYCHA as a part of a comprehensive plan would be very interesting to look at NYCHA as an asset, both the open space and the housing and so forth. That would be fascinating.
I mean, advocates have been advocating just to align from a housing policy perspective, the housing policy and NYCHA plan.
Right.
Let's start there.
Bring this panel to a close, but again, you've provided us with significant and material information. We will be back to the well. We hope that you will, make yourselves available to us when we do come back to the well. I can't give you specific dates, but we're going to be essentially dissecting many of the ideas that are being presented and thoroughly now analyzing them, aligning them with the charter. If you have written remarks and are willing to share them with us, we would appreciate that very, very much. So thank you for your time. And I imagine you'll be hearing from us again. We're going to take a 2-minute break, and then we're going to come back for the third and final panel for this evening. All right. Thank you. Just hold tight. Hi, I am going to call us back from break so that we can hear from our three remaining panelists and have opportunity for conversation. And so I want to welcome them into the room now. And they are Rebecca Bratspies, a law professor at the City University of New York, CUNY School of Law. She's the founding director of the Center for Urban Environmental Reform. She's an internationally recognized expert on environmental justice, the regulation of new agricultural technologies, and the human right to a healthy environment. Professor Bratspies has written scores of law review articles, op-eds, and other publications, including 4 books. Justin Garrett Moore is a transdisciplinary designer and urbanist and is the program officer for the Humanities in Place program at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. He has extensive planning and design experience from regional and urban systems, policies, and projects to grassroots and community-focused planning, design, public realm, and arts initiatives. At the Mellon Foundation, his work focuses on advancing equity, inclusion, and social justice through place-based initiatives, built environments, cultural heritage projects, digital and ephemeral, programs and commemorative spaces and landscapes. I've been going too long. And the last person is Ishima Harris, project director of East New York Farms and co-director at Green Gorillas. She's dedicated to integrating youth empowerment and leadership into adult-dominated sectors. Throughout her decade of involvement in the food justice movement, Ishima has taught food justice, advocated for universal free school lunch, assisted in the development and sustainment of youth-led organizations. She wishes to combine her passion for food justice and her knowledge of the American politics to drive the importance of food in people's everyday lives. We will begin with 8 minutes for each panelist and then a back and forth with our commission members with the panelists. The first person that we ask to speak is Professor Bratspies.
Well, thank you for inviting me to testify today. It's an honor to be here and to listen to all of the people who've come before, and I'm looking forward to hearing my fellow panelists. I want to start with the big picture and connect some dots about how we got to the situation that we're in, and then I'm going to offer 5 suggestions for charter revisions that might move us forward. Everyone has a right to breathe clean air and to drink clean water. Everyone. These are basic human rights recognized by the United Nations and by 150 nations that have enshrined these rights in their constitutions. This fall, New York will vote on whether to amend our constitution to add Section 19. Each person shall have a right to clean air and water and a healthful environment. While the United States Constitution doesn't have an explicit environmental provision, we do have laws that could do much the same thing. Specifically, Section 109 of the Clean Air Act requires that air quality standards be set at a level requisite to protect human health with an adequate margin of safety. That means, under existing domestic law, everyone should already have clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, a healthy neighborhood to live in. Unfortunately, the reality is often quite different. Too many of our Black and brown communities have been forced to fight tooth and nail for these basic human rights. Black communities, communities of color, low-income communities bear far more than their fair share of the environmental burdens in this city. Take a map of the neighborhoods in New York City that were redlined nearly a century ago. What you have is a map of the city's structural racism, the map that cut Black and brown neighborhoods out of the New Deal and out of the economic prosperity that it built. Now update that map. Add a layer for where New York City sited its power plants, where the city sited its wastewater treatment plants, where the private waste transfer stations are located, where the polluting industry is more generally. It's the same map. This is the map of New York City's environmental racism. It rests on the structural racism of redlining, but has been added to layer by layer by a city that ignored the needs and priorities of these communities. It is also a map of the neighborhoods burdened by over-policing and mass incarceration. Now take this map of structural racism and environmental racism, add to it the places with few green spaces or trees, the places where environmental enforcement is lax, the places where kids struggle with asthma and miss too much school because they are sick, the places with disproportionate cardiopulmonary disease, the places most vulnerable to the heat island effect, the places where COVID-19 hit the hardest. Once again, it's the same map. This is the map of New York City's environmental injustice, the impacts that polluting industry, that lack of enforcement has on the health and welfare of its most vulnerable residents. It is this map of environmental justice, of environmental racism, that we're talking about today, about how redrawing the city charter can change this situation. So just a few facts about the city to illustrate these points, and then I promise I'm going to get to my 5 suggestions. Until 2018, as you heard from Melissa, 4 neighborhoods processed 3/4 of the city's waste. All were and are overwhelmingly Black and brown. The stench, the dust, the traffic, the pollution for the entire city concentrated into 4 neighborhoods. This is environmental injustice. Many of the city's peaker plants predate the Clean Air Act. They're filthy, spewing particulates, nitrous oxides, and other pollutants as they start up and shut down, something peaker plants do frequently. Virtually all are in environmental justice communities. In fact, in 2000, the city cited 10 peaker plants in all, every single one of them in an environmental justice community. They were forced on communities without their input and over their objections, with virtually no environmental assessment, because they were supposed to be temporary for 3 years. Anyone born when the plants were built is now old enough to drink, and the plants are still there. 60% of the city's power is generated in one overburdened Queens neighborhood. And despite the CLCPA's carbon-free mandate, there are 2 fossil fuel plants currently trying to get new operating licenses in environmental justice communities in our city. The health implications of these disparities are overwhelming. New York City is a serious non-compliance zone for ozone, one of the pollutants regulated by the Clean Air Act. That means New Yorkers routinely breathe air that does not meet the standard requisite to protect public health. But the harm from this pollution is concentrated in just a few communities, low-income communities and communities of color. And just a sort of quick example, in Hunts Point, Mott Haven, an overwhelmingly Black and Latinx community, has extremely high levels of ozone and particulate pollution. Its asthma rate is more than double the citywide average. Its children visit hospital emergency rooms many, many times more than the citywide average. By contrast, Tottenville, a comparatively prosperous and overwhelmingly white neighborhood in Staten Island, has significantly less pollution. Its children suffer asthma at nearly an order of magnitude less than the citywide average. Right? We have vast disparities that we need to fix. Overall, a Black child in New York City is 42% more likely to have asthma than a white child, 8 times more likely to be hospitalized for asthma-related ailments, and 2 to 3 times more likely to miss school because of asthma. So there are charter revisions you can make that would start to end this legacy of structural environmental racism and help New York City move from environmental injustice to environmental justice. We all deserve to live in healthy communities, and these are 5 suggestions for how that might happen. First of all, the city charter could be amended to explicitly guarantee every city resident the right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, live in housing that is not toxic or damaging to their health. The city charter could also put environmental justice at its center. In doing this, we could use the recent New Jersey environmental justice law as a model. Environmental injustice would be a mandatory reason to deny a permit, a license, or a similar authority from the city. If a new facility would have a disproportionate negative impact on an already overburdened communities, the relevant agency should have to reject it. This would give teeth to the charter's fair share provision and require those who want to put polluting industry or locally undesirable land uses into already overburdened communities to justify it and come up with benefits for the community that will counteract these burdens. And pursuant to Local Law 60 of 2017, New York City just finished a map designating its environmental justice communities. This kind of a charter revision would be a way to make that designation meaningful and would also help implement the CLCPA's mandate that 35 to 40% of green energy benefits go to disadvantaged communities. Third, the city charter should learn from participatory budgeting. In participatory budgeting, communities speak first and last. Anyone over 12 has a voice, not based on citizenship, not based on property ownership, not based on any of the other privileges that skew our conversations. There's still a key role for agency expertise, but communities set the agenda, and regulators take seriously their self-identified needs and priorities. Conversations occur in community spaces, accessible to those with disabilities, where people feel safe, welcomed, and valued, and at times that work for working people and for parents. And the things that come out of this process are amazing. Renewable Rikers is an example of the kind of transformative proposals that emerge from this kind of community-driven policymaking. And as part of this approach, community boards need to be entirely rethought. They need widespread representation. They need, for sure, more NYCHA representation, and they need teeth so that communities are in the driver's seat about development and land use plan decision-making. The charter could explicitly recognize that all property is held subject to a social mortgage. This is a recognition that private property ownership confers stewardship obligations. Just as a conventional mortgage binds the homeowner to repay the institution that made that home ownership possible, a social mortgage obligates the property owner to recognize their obligation to the community that made the ownership of the property possible. Through providing services such as healthcare, education, transportation, police and fire protection, as well as through the cultural vibes that make neighborhoods desirable. It converts property ownership from an extractive to a participatory stance, recognizing the stake that in the community with those of no private property holdings. It can be a way to change how we think of as-of-right zoning. A land use planning process built on this foundation will be more just and more equal and may be capable of addressing the displacement problem we've all been talking about. Finally, the city needs to reward its workforce for their role in making environmental justice manifest. The charter should require that agencies include explicit environmental justice metrics in every promotion job description. They should evaluate their workers' productivity and excellence based on how responsive they are, how they solve community problems, how they achieve inclusion and equity, not how many fines or tickets they issue or how many projects get built, or at least not only that. So anyway, I'm going to stop my remarks there. I would look forward to the conversation, and I'm glad to provide any follow-up information you might like. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we will hear from Justin Garrett Moore.
Thank you, and Professor Bratspies, that was incredible to hear your remarks. I underline and agree with most of it. So thank you to this commission for inviting me to share some thoughts. This obviously is an incredibly important conversation and an important time for us to explore together what we are collectively doing for our city, for our communities, and generally as people. So for those of you that don't know, I was formerly in the administration as the head of the Public Design Commission, and before that, had a long career in city government with the Department of City Planning, and my expertise really does connect to this broader topic about how communities change. And I think this charter revision conversation is an opportunity for us to think in a more complete way about how we change and what needs to change. So we were given a couple prompts and questions, big ideas that are being proposed or tested in my field. I work across multiple fields, so planning, policy, and design. And the thing that I would say is the most important and most encouraging is that social justice and racial equity explicitly are increasingly being used directly to shape and inform how planning, development, and design are sort of explored and used and implemented in different places. So for example, in urban planning, there are important conversations about the role of changing economies and changing relationships to things like housing and figuring out how do we even conceive of land uses and how those are regulated, and that there's a need to be more flexible and more adaptable to a wider variety of uses, but also a wider variety of people, a wider variety of cultures, a wider variety of circumstances that impact how we literally use land. How do we use our spaces, right? So the current paradigm of zoning and planning that is largely structured and based on, to be frank, a Eurocentric and even white supremacist framing for how planning, zoning, policies, and design have been implemented, and there's a very deep legacy to that, are being questioned and are being challenged. That's happening in certain fields and definitely sort of in spaces of scholarship. It's happening in spaces of sort of activism, but government is way behind, still fully entrenched in the structures of policy and power that have been designed for inequality. And I'm going to underline that point again. The structures of our government, our planning, our policy and design have been designed for inequality. And so when you're looking at the systems, if you're nibbling around the edges with different sort of conversations, how can we make our planning process have better community engagement? That's the wrong approach, because the whole system is designed to create this difference. And so adding community engagement, more community meetings, you know, oh, we'll add a few more steps in the process. You're not actually addressing the issue. What you're doing is actually sort of enabling the current system to do its job even better. So I just want to underline that as kind of a key point. So that's something that is happening in the field and happening in practice, and people are starting to challenge it. The second piece of that is an idea that, aside from the kind of the planning and policy side, that there's an approach to thinking about design and place in a way that broadens who gets the ability to inform what happens, who gets to create, who gets to change, who gets to challenge, is something that we need to reevaluate. Who is designing the work? You know, the fields largely, when you look at all the consultants and the firms that are doing all this work, they don't reflect the communities that are impacted and affected. So great strides have been made for things like minority and business enterprise policies and things of that nature, but they're really not being done in a way that is systematic enough to address issues of planning, policy, and design that can have a potentially huge impact in terms of better connecting and relating to again, that difficult process of how communities are changing in our societies. The last piece, and it definitely goes back to Professor Bratspies' point, is that there's a big picture, big vision approach, which is to think about what are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Right, so this is a very big picture conversation about globally, what are our human rights, our environmental needs and responsibilities and stewardship that are required for us to live together, right? And in the global way, what does it take for us to live together? The UN Sustainable Development Goals has these 17 kind of frameworks, everything from climate and stewardship of environment to addressing issues of social equity, economic opportunity, gender equality, et cetera. There's sort of a framework that people globally are starting to connect with, think about, and work with, and that's something that is obviously relatively new. I believe it was probably 2015 that I think that it was started, and we're working with a much older infrastructure for how we even think about these issues, right? Again, one of these legacies for how the systems have been designed have taught us to think, well, we need a health department and an education department and a police department. Instead, there may need to be another kind of approach to even how we structure and frame these conversations around a broader set of goals that are interconnected, and I would even add the word intersectional to that, to think about how we're structuring our government, how we're making our decisions. The other sort of question that we were given is, what are the major structural roadblocks in achieving racial justice? So I would say that the first one, well, it's not the first one, but the one that I want to say and highlight because it doesn't get said often enough, is that white and wealthy people have to give up something, or at least perceive, accept that they may need to give up something. We've seen this over and over, that communities of color are asked to do more, they're asked to grow, they're asked to change, they're asked to take on more than their fair share, and be told that this is how you're going to see investment, that this is how you're going to see opportunity, is that you have to change. But we never ask that of the higher income and frankly, the whiter communities in the city and in America and globally. And so that's a sort of a conversation. It's not directly something you can change in a charter, right? It's kind of a bigger conversation. But in the charter and in government, you can start to put mechanisms and policies in place that require that the question be asked, right? That require that sort of the equity and the decision-making and distribution of resources, of infrastructure, of where change is happening is needed. The last point in my sort of wrap up is to ask what changes in the law or charter would I propose? And my direct proposal would be for the New York City charter to create a new entity or new agency called the Department of Care. The Department of Care would be a way to work across all of those aforementioned silos and structures to go toward an approach and a system that looks toward what does it take to care for and maintain and be healthy together across all the different ways that that happens, whether it's built environment or operational, and to resource it accordingly so that we spend our money and our land and our time in ways that are toward caring for people as opposed to only building and let's call it enforcing people. And I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your remarks. I will now turn to Ishima Harris, and we'll hear from her and then we'll have a conversation. Ishima.
Thank you. So in my field of expertise or area of focus, which is urban agriculture and youth development, we have supported the notion that community gardens are the melting pot of cultural diffusion. So we've used this form of community mobilization to integrate heritage cultural lessons through intergenerational exchanges with youth interns and elders, or youth in general and elders. We're also able to share experiences and ideologies over decades just by growing food. East New York, which is the community I'm from, has 50 plus community gardens and farms ranging from private land ownership, backyard gardens, or government entities. Due to the diffusion of cultural exchanges, food growers are able to develop self-resilience among themselves by sharing supplies, seeds, and equipment. We reduce racial inequity by educating community gardeners about the land, how to access the land and the space that they're on, and how to also preserve that land by implementing systems that will allow for them to have transitional generational plans. And also to continue mobilizing and supporting the local food access that communities of color has. We understand that racial inequity leads to economical and infrastructural inequity. Therefore, at East New York Farms, we create a network of community gardeners that they're able to sell their produce that they grow at our farmers markets in order to make an income, because most of our community gardens are retirees or elders. So they live on a fixed income already. This also stimulates local economic wealth. In urban agriculture, we do not have the concrete data that is needed to give a snapshot of how diverse or how much food we're producing in the city in general and how we're help shaping and moving the food infrastructure. And I think that's because no one really cares about local community gardeners or food producers in the city. And sometimes this could be due to lack of funding. Maybe there's not certain infrastructure set in place for organizations to conduct those studies. On my daily interaction at urban farms or urban community gardens, I encounter people of color, mainly women, typically elders. Community food growers have been fighting for their stake in the food movement for decades, as they have put in laborsome hours on the land with a fracture of the reward. Urban agriculturalists are left abandoned a lot of times. Three major roadblocks are lack of funding for local community gardens, and also CBOs, lack of legal protection for community gardeners outside of license agreements, and also burdensome expectations that are placed on local community gardeners in order for them to open their gates and have a 24-hour access or 8-hour access out of the day to community members. To dig a bit deeper, community gardeners are elders, and there are barriers that prevents them from applying to certain grants, barriers like technology or lack of knowledge when it comes to applying for statuses like 501c3s. Since most community gardens do not have their 501c3 status, they have to either rely on other 501c3 organizations as a conduit of them getting funding for their gardens, or they cannot apply for those funds that are available. So we see the barriers that's separating community gardeners from advanced organizations or other entities that might take advantage of those grants. But within my field, community gardens, they really need the support. So as having other 501c3 entities as a conduit for them to receive funding, then that nonprofit organization become financially burdened by having to track all that grants and funding for all the community gardens that they might be fiscal sponsors for, which goes to the not so well structured not so well structured entity of nonprofit organization. That's a different conversation. And we also try to make sure that community gardens or local CBOs are fighting to maintain programs and operations that they have going on already, but we realize that a lot of fundings that's available are for STEM programs, and STEM programs are dedicated to aquaponic and hydroponic farms, which then goes into a lot of infrastructure in terms of like building or housing developments that are going up in the city, that then grants require us to like think bigger, think wiser, have a rooftop garden, like, you know, and then it's like, what happens to our land space? What happens to community gardens if we then have rooftop gardens? So there's a lot of unparalleled or unbalanced funding streams that goes out to local urban agriculture programs that are not STEM based. And those are barriers that prevents local CBOs from hiring within the community, from expanding their programs, from having job readiness programs, and also college readiness programs in their local neighborhoods. So we see a lot of CBOs that are really struggling, especially during this pandemic, where all the money has been going towards food pantries, but not really to the workers who have to work those food pantries. We live in a fast, advancing society where every year we get bigger, we get better, but we need to not rush nature as we are competing with ourselves at the cost of losing our homes. And finally, to grow food, you need passion, love, and time. Community gardeners and farmers dedicate such work ethics to preserve access to local food in their communities, especially in people of color communities where diabetes, hypertension is at higher rates, and obesity. I am not aware of when growing food is needed so much like bureaucracy and control. However, I do know that the selflessness and passion food producers harness. Before we instill guidelines and requirements, I encourage you to speak to the individuals that these laws, guidelines, and infrastructure might affect. We all have a voice, but we're not all at the table. Thank you.
I thank all three of you. I really appreciate the remarks that you each provided. And let me just say that, the common thread that I heard, even though you were speaking from different vantage points, is centering on these structures that essentially are perpetually, that were purposed to provide for inequity and equality, and are continuing to prop it up. And that is at the very core of what we're aiming to address here. And so your points, your remarks are spot on. Spot on. Really appreciate what each of you has shared with us. And I'm going to give the commission members an opportunity to weigh in at this point. I actually see that Commission Member Laurie Daniel Favors feels, as I do, that your remarks are amazingly helpful as she shared. And if you'd like to say a few words or ask a few questions, Commission Member Daniel Favors, please.
Chair, I actually have no questions. I am just filled with gratitude and a lot more optimism after having listened to each of you speak. This work is so difficult in so many ways and can be so demoralizing. So I'm just very grateful and appreciative to all of you for centering true approaches to racial justice in your work. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. I see that Commission Member Thompson looks like he's come off. I don't know if he intentionally unmuted, but I don't know if you have some remarks that you'd like to share. If you do,
I did intentionally unmute, but I'm really intrigued by the last panelist and her discussion of urban gardening, and it just reminds me of a mentor of my father's, Reverend Vernon Johns. And Reverend Johns used to come and preach at our church, and he'd always preach in overalls, bib overalls, and he'd drive a truck full of watermelon and collard greens and hams from Southern farms. And he said, all you Black folks up north, you eat all this stuff, but Black farmers are gone out of business. And how can that be? Something's going wrong in the middle. And, between the farmers and us who are buying and eating that stuff. And this last panelist made me think, like, DOE buys 190 million meals a year. So isn't that a market for, community gardens and urban farmers right here in front of us? And I'd love a reaction or comment, but I just think there's huge potential right here for us to build a self-supporting ecosystem. And maybe one of the experts here could comment on that.
I could comment. I think there is what Justin mentioned is like the system is not really a system. It's not working. I think there is a way for us to be resilient in New York City and in the work that we do, but no one is willing to take that step, or no one is willing to give something up in order for that to happen. My very first garden that I built was on a DOE school property, and they completely wiped it out and expanded sports activity because the DOE did not want to fund lessons or students to be a part of the lessons that were taking place at the garden. And people loved it, and people enjoyed having a garden there because they're able to see a greenhouse, they're able to have an aquaponic system, a hydroponic system, and be able to have lunch in the garden. But I think the system is broken. As much as we think about food, as much as we gravitate to food, I don't think that we really paid much attention to the laws or infrastructure around food. So a lot of times when it comes to food, we're always telling people to eat healthy, but we're not educating them on that. And if we're educating them on that, they don't have jobs where they could eat healthy or buy the healthier options. So it's just like a cycle of failure every single step of the way that you go, until there's a change where someone or a group of people are like, I'm willing to give this up in order for you to have this. That's the only way in which we'll see a system that is fair and equitable, especially in New York City.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I see that Justin has put into the chat.
I just quickly wanted to share my grandfather ran a large urban agriculture program in Indianapolis, where I'm from originally, in the 1940s and 1950s, at scale, over 200 acres, serving hundreds of families. And it underlines Ms. Harris's point about all the different types of work needed. And so they had cooperative grocery, they had training programs to actually teach people how to cook food correctly. And so it does need to be thought of at the kind of the systems level, and not only like one individual garden. One individual garden is not going to win against the system, right? Or, you know, one principal going on a limb to order the food, right? It really needs to happen at a certain scale to be sustainable.
A lot being written, just, you know, what has happened at the federal level with the funding that has been denied Black farmers, despite repeated efforts and calls for greater support. Well, Derek, did you want to comment, please?
Yeah, I mean, I'll join the bandwagon and agree with the comments that a lot of inequality is structured, and that Black farmers have been defrauded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture historically, and in some ways contemporary. I also just want to mention that a colleague and a friend, Dennis Derrick, has a Corbin Hill project that's intended to bring, so I guess people are aware of it, to match food deserts in New York City with farmers upstate and elsewhere, and with an emphasis on communities of color. So I have a question. The question is, it was the issue of, we often ask of Black and other Indigenous, Latinx, and communities of color to make sacrifices to address the values of equity, to make $1 out of 15 cents in a proverbial way. But then, you know, the provocative notion of, should we ask more of those that are more fortunate to achieve the value of equity? Are there any ways we can structure this? You know, I can think of, you know, for instance, an idea that I've championed a lot, baby bonds, and some people are talking about wealth taxes as a mechanism, or a inheritance tax as a mechanism of funding it. But are there any ways we could think creative about structural ways that we can achieve civic values around equity that that are fair, but also structural, particularly at the local level?
And I mean, I would say that Professor Bratspies' point about the kind of the environmental provisions is a great way to start the conversation about kind of what people call fair share, right? Who's being asked to provide for our city's waste infrastructure is one sort of question, but it also could be which communities and geographies are being asked to address our housing needs, right? Where is growth happening? You know, we had all the what were called the contextual rezonings or down zonings that largely went to protect certain communities from growth and development, and at the same time, Black and Brown communities are being asked to take more growth and development while having less resources. So there's what in the field we call spatial justice. So if you look at where things are happening, there's typically a connection to who it's happening to. And so the wealth taxes, all of those provisions that kind of work on an economic level are definitely one way and one approach, but there are actually multiple approaches that you might look at where things are happening. So for example, where are new park investments being made, right? Little island out on the Hudson River, you know, big project, big investment in parks. Where are parks not being built and being invested in is a question that can be asked structurally by the government, right? Through mechanisms that could have data and evaluation and consultation and a sort of more complete way of thinking about where investment happens, where growth happens, who's responsible for taking care of everyone collectively. The other point I'll raise, and it's to related to Ms. Harris's point, and why I talk about the kind of the concept of a Department of Care, is that when you look at New York City and its kind of broader labor force and economy, who is doing what kind of work has a complexion, right? We all know this. How that work and labor is valued has to do with our systems, right? So people being that are doing what is often called care work or kind of housekeeping work, you know, taking care of elderly, doing things like gardening and growing food aren't valued as much as someone that's, you know, in Wall Street, right? Government does have the potential to kind of rethink and reframe that by virtue of the scale of its investments and kind of how it's doing work. And so the idea of valuing care and knowing kind of who is doing care work is a way to also sort of address some of those imbalances. And again, asking people who are more privileged or have kind of legacies of privilege to sort of shift resources toward those kinds of work and those types of places is really, really important conversation. And how we structure government, again, through the lens of spatial way of thinking about it is one mechanism to do that beyond only kind of taxing or even political processing.
If I could follow up on Dr. Moore's comments, care work was excluded from the labor laws that were enacted as part of the New Deal, as was farm labor, and that was explicitly a racialized choice. It was intended to exclude Black workers from the protections that the federal government was extending to workers more generally. And I think that talking about that repeatedly and emphasizing that these, you know, facially neutral laws are in fact discriminatory at their core is an important step forward there. And I also agree 100% about the spatiality, if that's a word, of the way that we think about justice and injustice. We talk a lot about overburdened communities, but underburdened isn't even a word. And the reason we have overburdened communities is because the burdens that should be borne by other communities have been transferred to them. And I think that's one of the problems I have with the way the SDGs are set up. I think they do a lot of interesting things, but they focus entirely on the overburdened communities without recognizing that someone is overburdening them, and that solving the problem can't be about those communities alone. It's got to be about the communities that are transferring their obligations to them. We saw the city try to do that a little bit, make a tentative first step in the waste equity, the solid waste plan and the waste equity bill of 2018. Those are, a very modest model, but certainly we can be explicit about that, and maybe the charter can be explicit about that and say that, fair share really means that everybody has an equal obligation to deal with the waste that we generate, the pollution that we generate. Everybody has not only has to bear a fair share of the burdens, but has a right to the fair share of the benefits as well, has a right to a fair share of the green space, has a right to a fair share of public transit, a right to a fair share of schools that are well funded and have heating systems and cooling systems that work, and have rooms that are adequate and appropriate for learning, and has space for community gardens and all of the benefits that come with this fabulous city that we have.
I'm curious, have you all spent any time with the social indicators report that the city is required to, by charter, although it doesn't happen every year, the city is required by charter to publish annually a social indicators report. that is centered on, the aim is to assess equity, assess inequity across communities, I think the 59 community districts, by looking at better than 100 indicators that, range from, health and environmental concerns to housing and income and everything that we're looking at. I ask because I'm just appreciating that I believe everyone, but you all are just triggering for me in this moment, that you're looking at the panelists we've heard from today and others, just taking a look at those indicators and perhaps giving us your feedback as to, if and where they're hitting the mark and where they are missing the mark. It's published, I think the last one was done in 2019. It is a charter requirement. It's not, there have been instances when the city government has said that they provided other things, like the Center for Economic Opportunity during the Bloomberg administration said we're providing poverty, anti-poverty activity reports, and that meets the requirement. I personally, in my organization, pushed back on that, and I do know that the Blasio administration has done it from, on a couple of years, in a couple of years, but not necessarily every year. Just think that your insights there would be very helpful. So I know we've asked a lot of you already, but if you could take a look at that and just give us your sense of that as well. I think it's been put into the chat. Thank you. Thank you very much. And then we have 2 minutes left, and I would appreciate hearing if there's anything more that you'd like to add, Mr. Moore, concerning the Department of Care. We've been talking about perhaps having a mayor's office of equity that is centered on, the implementation across the agencies of various strategies, initiatives pursuant to what comes down through the charter reform. And that would also maybe, be the keeper, if you will, of accountability. But we haven't really gone beyond that. So don't know if you have any thoughts in this moment, but if you do, we'd appreciate hearing them. And if you want to share some more with us and others, if you have thoughts about that, we'd appreciate this.
Sure, yeah, I'll give a little background in that. The idea in the conversation came from a lot of different spaces, including activist spaces from last summer, from all of the conversations and protests after the George Floyd killing, and of course the conversations about the city's budget and in particular the PD budget, and the idea and concept of, if you were to do something different with $1 billion, what was needed. Clearly at the time, between an obvious public health crisis, an obvious discrepancy between what people had access to in wealthy communities versus lower income communities, and a growing crisis on homelessness and what people were calling kind of quality of life conditions, right? The trash and the rats and all of that. The concept that we needed $1 billion for care, right? Was sort of the immediate prompt. But of course, we need a lot more than $1 billion for care. We needed actually an infrastructure to ensure that all of those different types of work, everything from your block being clean and healthy to someone that needs help being able to get help, and that all of the different modes and ways that happens needed to be reevaluated. And so the structures, and anyone, I don't know if you all looked at the organization chart for the city of New York with all the agencies and departments. You'll see the silos, and the challenge is to get some kind of integration and intersection between where and how people get services and get care. It's a huge challenge for a city as big as New York, and government is as large and complex as ours. But the idea of Department of Care isn't necessarily a new agency with building somewhere. It's embedded across the entire government, right? The Department of Ed, Department of Care, the Police Department, Department of Care, aging, transportation, et cetera, to get these connections happening outside of the kind of the city hall political process approach, because the city hall political process is another engine of inequality.
That's helpful. That's helpful. So you're the intersectionalities or the cross, the critical joined up work that is necessary.
Exactly.
Okay. This has been rich. So as I've communicated to other panelists, we will likely be coming back to the well. What we're doing here is you're providing us with information that we then are going to, essentially work up. We're in the process right now of identifying what are the themes. And in many instances, they are cross-cutting themes. We're appreciating we will not in the New York City Charter be able to put forward like 300, 400 ideas, and the numbers are growing, but we're just trying to find the themes and the root causes, if you will, that tie back to structural racism, and then tackling them accordingly. So we would appreciate the opportunity to follow up with you as we are delving into these issues and find ourselves with questions and the need for more thought leader input. So we ask that you just keep your doors open to us. We very much thank you and appreciate you for the time that you've given us. And I'll just say for the work that you all are doing. So vital and so important, and we're grateful. We're grateful to you. This concludes this conversation. Our next meeting will be August 10th at 3 p.m. Our next panel centered on achieving economic equity and closing the racial wealth gap. That'll be next Tuesday, August 10th at 3 p.m. And you can access it using the same website that you've accessed this meeting, where you access this meeting. I will also share that tomorrow we will have our second in-person public engagement forum, and that will be at Bethany Baptist Church in Brooklyn, New York. That is the location. At 460 Marcus Garvey Boulevard. I can do that without even looking at the notes for personal reasons. 460 Marcus Garvey Boulevard in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and that meeting begins at, the doors will open at 5 p.m. and the meeting will begin at 5:30 p.m. We look to hear from the public at that meeting, and so if you would like to attend, we ask that you come and you register, and then we'll have an opportunity to engage in a rich conversation. So that's tomorrow at 5 p.m. and then we have another on Thursday evening in Queens, and I don't know that information by heart, so I'm going to turn to our executive director, Anisha Venkataraman, to help us.
Happily. So on Thursday, we will be at Queens Borough Hall, also at 5 p.m. So we will look forward to seeing folks out there. Please spread the word, share with any community member, any New Yorker can attend and testify at any of the borough hearing, whether they live in that borough or not, and information can be found on our website to register for those.
Excellent. So again, thank you to all the panelists, and I thank the commissioners for joining us and participating in this conversation, this panel discussion, and I wish you all a very good evening.
Thank you so much.